The lady was an ordinary student in her past life, a graduate. She did not do anything remarkable, so she met an unfair death. However, later she came back to life, and not only found herself in the world of the stupid novel she had read the day before, she is reborn in the body of a villainess who will suffer a horrible death at the end of the story. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what to do in this situation. She knew that if she left things as they were, the main characters would kill her. She knew that they would not hesitate and would decide everything quickly. She was puzzled because she understood that she could not avoid death. She understood that both in the past and in the new world, she spreads early with her life. The young man looked at her intently and called out. She was taken aback and left her thoughts. She sighed heavily looking at the young man. He looked at her intently and said that she had that expression on her face again. He looked at her intently and said, puzzled, that she must not tell him that she had been thinking about that bastard again. She looked at him intently and, sighing heavily, said that it was impossible because she was his wife. The incredibly strange thing was that the person she possessed was the worst villain she knew, that everyone's hatred towards her must be completely justified. He looked at her intently and quietly said that she should stay close to him. He said that she must not forget that only one person in this world could make her a duchess, and that was him. She was lost in her thoughts and remembered the young man who was calling her pitifully. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to see something like this. Callus sighed heavily and asked what he could do to get her back. He said he was ready for anything and she just had to tell him. The young lady looked at Syria with a smile and said that she wanted to see her change into her wedding dress. Syria asked in surprise what she was talking about. She was shocked, wondering if the young lady really wanted to see her naked. The lady looked at her intently and asked if her mother was not a commoner who became an aristocrat. She said with a grin that she wished she could say the same about her mother. Syria was shocked, as even the main character had changed. She was puzzled and wondered if she would be able to survive in a new world, in a new, unusual story. The girl looked at the young lady intently and called out to her a moment later. She asked Syria if she wanted to live. The girl told her that if she wanted this, she should think carefully about her desires. She said that she should think about what she wanted to come to. She was in shock as she was lying at the altar covered in blood. She was momentarily taken aback when she saw a young man urinating near her and calling her, but it was all in vain because she was quietly leaving the world. The lady told Syria that the empire had a bright future. She smiled and said that the saint had come down from heaven, which meant that they were blessed from above. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was her fiancé who was standing next to her. She sighed heavily and said that they were similar, had become very close, and now was the time to be jealous of them. Syria was simply furious because she knew that their wedding was in a week and he was already flirting with someone else. She wanted to pull his hair out. But she knew there were a lot of prying eyes around. Syria said with a smile that her fiancé was just very sociable. The lady told her that she still had not recovered from her cold, and also said that she would bring her some medicine that evening. A moment later, the Duke visited them and told the lady that she would spend the whole day on the terrace with her patient. The young lady was taken aback and greeted the Duke. The Duke told her that if she remained there and her condition worsened, her importunate fiancé would consider it his duty to make a scene and send for the high priest. The Duke said that they should escort the saint to the upper church as quickly as possible because he did not want any scandals in his house. The young lady knew that he might seem unfriendly, but the day would come when love would appear in his gaze on the saint. She understood perfectly well that such a fate awaited the main character at the end of the story. They are characters in a romance novel about a dimension-jumping heroine named Lena. She ended up in another world where the main characters showed her love, and she ended up in a villain who would soon face a terrible death. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect that she would become Syria Stern. Syria inherited the power of the gods and was able to obtain the title of Stern, thereby becoming the holiest being in the empire. But her bad temper pushed her to meanness. She could be described as a walking problem of high society. She was occupied with extravagance in which she excelled, unlike relationships with family which have become incredibly disgusting. After moving into the villain's body, there was only one thought in her head. She didn't want to die. She understood that before the main character appeared, she needed to come up with a way to get rid of all the enemies that the young lady had previously made for herself. She offered her sincere apologies to everyone with lightning speed. The young lady also gave everyone gifts. She knew that trying to change a reputation was like a lonely, difficult struggle. The young lady looked at the young man and said that she would cure him because she had brought herbs from the rocks behind the church. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really meant to say that she had dared to go to the rocks alone. She said that she had. She knew that Callus was the one who killed Saria. She knew she had to come up with something to please him. Callus looked at her intently and asked what had made her change so much, and unexpectedly for her, he had fallen in love with her. Sometime later, they were walking happily and having a good time. One fine day, he smiled and gave her a ring and proposed to her. She knew that in the original story, the main character and heroine fell in love with each other. But she knew that the young man had decided to commit suicide out of despair, so she thought that this turn of events was for the best. She knew perfectly well that this was the perfect change in the plot. But in turn, she wondered if she had not been in their path, love would have developed between them. She really hoped that she would not get into a love triangle because the lady was soon supposed to get along with the Duke. But a few days later, Lena happily told Callus's fiancé that she was very glad to meet her. She smiled and introduced herself. Lena said with a joyful smile she really dreamed of seeing her. The young lady in turn was like the ocean, didn't understand what was going on at all because she didn't want to have anything to do with the main character. Lena said with a smile that she felt a little embarrassed that people called her a saint because she came from another world. Saria looked at her intently and said that she knew it. In turn, she tried her best to avoid the young lady. Lena said that she heard Saria today. She will try on a wedding dress. Saria said that everything is exactly like that. Lena said with a happy smile that the wedding dress from another world was simply amazing because everyone here wore magnificent dresses. Saria in turn was furious because she did not understand why the saint called her fiancé by name. Saria knew that it took her a long time to do this, but she easily called him by name. Lena called out to the young lady with a joyful smile. She looked at her intently and said she wanted to see her change into her wedding dress. Saria in turn froze in surprise on the spot. She wondered if it was really Sveta. I wanted to see her naked. A moment later, a lady entered the room and, asking the saint's forgiveness, said that trying on wedding dresses was not a performance. Begonia that the privilege of attending fittings extends only to the bride's guests, close relatives and best friends. Begonia looked at the saint with fury and said that she did not belong to any of them. The young lady asked for forgiveness with tears in her eyes and said that she was still not accustomed to the events of the new world. Begonia was also a villain in the original story. Eventually, Callus fired her for her cruel treatment of Lena. The saint looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and said goodbye to her. Saria was shocked by everything that was happening. She did not understand why the moment that was in the book happened. Saria in turn knew that the course of other events had to change. Saria asked in surprise why she needed to change her dressmaker. Callus said that she should understand this since she was already there. He said that the saint was sent to them by heaven, and of course she was completely different from simple aristocrats. He said that since the dressmaker could not understand this, allowing herself to be treated so rudely, it would be better to fire her. Saria said that the runner only told the world not to look at her while she was changing clothes according to the standards of aristocrats. This is a saint. She behaved impolitely. The young lady looked at her fiancé with anger and asked if he had really called the saint by name in the presence of his bride. Callus said that he understood because it was his mistake. He said that his attitude towards the dressmaker's actions was due to the fact that he was appointed the saint's protector. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that even this coincided. In the original, the saint's divine power became extremely unstable after she came to their world. The powers that be of the High Church chose her protector from the heads of the 17 houses that possessed the power of the gods, and it turned out to be Callus. Callus asked the lady if she was worried that he had forgotten to tell the protector about his appointment. The young lady knew that perhaps she had been too pompous. She knew that if she got angry now, everything could end up like in the book. She looked intently at the young man and said with a smile that she understood him well. He looked at her with a smile and said that he felt relieved now because he was afraid that she might be offended. He smiled and thanked her for her understanding. Sometime later, the young lady sat near the wall, trembling with fear. Callus hastily asked for forgiveness and said that the saint's divine power had gone out of control and he must visit her immediately. Ever since he said her name, not a day had passed without her meeting, and now the young lady understood why Saria was a villain. The knight commander greeted Saria with a smile and also said that she seemed to be very tired from checking the glacier today. Within the domain of House Burke, there is an unusual accumulation of ice known as the Monster Tomb. The house was instructed to periodically check the barrier near it to prevent the appearance of monsters. This requires the power of the gods which the Sterns possess. In the original story, the young lady refused to go near the lake. She understood perfectly well that if she wanted to strengthen her position and survive here, she needed to fulfill all her duties. Elliot said with a smile that it was time for them to go back. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he really thought it was time for them to go. A moment later, the Duke approached them and asked what they were doing there. The young lady ran away for a moment and looked at the Duke with bewilderment. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, waiting for an answer. A moment later, he couldn't resist asking if she hadn't heard his question. Saria looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady was shocked and wondered if she had done something wrong. He looked at her intently and asked why she had come to the lake in such weather, not having recovered from her cold. The young lady thanked him for his concern but also said that she was already feeling much better. She told the Duke that it was her duty to come here, and he asked with cold fury when she had taken her duties seriously. The captain of the knights was alarmed and puzzled by their quarrel. The Duke asked if she was trying to weaken her health even more in order to attract the attention of her fiancé. The knight was in shock and called out to the Duke in alarm. She looked at him intently and said that she had no personal reasons for coming here. Looking at the Duke, she said that no matter how sick she was, her fiancé would not cause panic in his palace. The rest looked at the young lady and asked if the Marquise had a love affair with the saint. The young lady froze for a moment from this question. She was shocked and didn't understand how he could even say something like that. He sighed heavily and asked if they were finished with the check. The knight looked at the Duke intently and said that they were quite finished. He smiled and said that thanks to the young lady's hard work, they got it done quickly. He told the Duke with a smile that without her he would have had to stay another half day. The young lady was furious. She did not understand who the Duke thought he was and why he spoke with such arrogance. She looked at the Duke intently as she assumed the point was that he was the main character. She saw that he was very attractive, but she didn't understand why they made him so ugly. A moment later, the Duke said that in that case they could return. Saria looked away as their eyes almost met. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and stood frozen in place in surprise as the Duke threw his cloak over her. He looked at her closely and said that they could not allow her health to deteriorate any further. The young lady froze for a moment. She did not understand why he suddenly became kind after his barbed remarks. The young lady walked slowly through the garden and wondered if he liked her more than she thought. But she still decided that it was better to avoid the Duke because there was something scary about him. There was only one reason why she had to stay in the Burke house. The Sterns were considered saints in the Empire. Therefore, they are allowed to take part in important ceremonies, such as the exchange of wedding vows, only in a few, one of them the Burke house, which protected the frozen lake. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew she was being stupid. She wanted to avoid holding the wedding on the estate at all costs. Mostly because there were multiple main characters, she also knew that the Saint and the Duke would get married at the end of the story, and in the end it turns out that Lena is also stern. She thought that this was too tricky for the main character because she was a saint and also a slut. She understood perfectly well that this information would only be at the end, and if she got married and moved out quietly, that would be very good. A moment later, the young lady turned around as someone called her. The accompanying knight of Saria Abigail Orion looked at the young lady and greeted her with a smile. Saria asked her knight various questions with lightning speed. Saria asked if she had killed anyone by accident. Ebby smiled and said that she specialized exclusively in bandits. Ebby said with a smile that everything went well. However, she missed Saria when her armor became cold as ice. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew she had to go with them. One of the most important reasons why the world needs Sterns is because the equipment is made using constellation steel. The armor is able to protect the wearer from magic poisoning. Ebby looked at the young lady with a smile and threw a shawl over her shoulders, saying that it was time for them to go inside as she might catch a cold. The young lady froze for a moment as she remembered the Duke who had also wrapped her up. Now she understood why he behaved this way with her, because everyone was worried about her because she was stern. Syria looked closely at her knight and with a smile asked him to tell her everything that had happened to her. At the same time, a young lady was watching their conversation closely. The man looked closely at the saint and said that Miss Syria had changed a lot over the past year. He smiled and said that she had become close to the Marquis. Lena asked why she went to the Glacier every day. The man said that it was all because she was sterna, and only they could clear the lake barrier. He said that she had recently received an award from the palace for her diligence in carrying out her duties. The saint sighed heavily and said that she envied her. She looked at the man and asked if she could have the title of sterna. He looked at her in surprise and said that she was already considered a saint. She smiled and asked if sterna didn't sound cool. Only her magic could clear the barrier, so everyone in the palace was interested in her. The man smiled and said that there would soon be a lavish reception in her honor, but before that she needed to learn the rules of etiquette. He looked intently at the saint and began to talk about the Sterns. Lena, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and said that she was very envious of her. The lady looked at Syria intently and said that her birthday was coming soon. She smiled and said that she needed to drink some winter environment for her cold. Syria smiled and said that it was true and that her birthday was coming soon, and she had forgotten about it. Syria was born on a winter Wednesday. A person must meet a couple of conditions to receive such a title. One of the conditions is to be born on a winter Wednesday. The Wednesday child is filled with sadness, while the Thursday child is filled with love, and the Friday child treats others with kindness and courtesy. She wondered if this was too unfair to those born on Wednesday. In the original, when the lady heard these lines in a church song, she found them unfair. But becoming a stern, she soon came to love birthdays. The title was given to her at the age of 15, when the awakening of her spiritual power was marked by the appearance of a small star on her neck. She immediately renounced her family name and began to use the title name instead as a matter of pride. The lady looked at her closely and said that the saint continued to be interested in the steel of the constellation, and this was worrying. Syria asked if it was dangerous for her to approach the steel when her power had not yet stabilized. The lady said that the saint had a very curious nature. Syria knew that the walking curiosity was a typical heroine. However, she became a sterna reaching for the steel of the constellation. She knew she didn't have to worry about it because after the wedding, she would leave and live peacefully in the Marquise's house until the story came to an end. After some time, the young lady was very puzzled because she did not understand why they kept bumping into each other. A few minutes ago in the Green Garden storage room, a young lady was admiring the silver laurel branches. She knew that if stubble could become a plant, it would probably be like this. Silver laurel, whose branches contain the power to purify, is also used by knights as an analog of stubble in its absence. She was leaving the garden with a joyful smile, but accidentally bumped into someone. The Duke looked at her closely and said that she seemed to be in good spirits. The young lady was taken aback and a moment later greeted him, but unfortunately she questioned all her branches. A moment later she began nervously gathering her branches. After a few seconds the Duke also began to help her, and he also asked if she was heading to the lake again today. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect to see such a thing, but a moment later she said that it was exactly like that. He looked at her intently and said that there was something he couldn't understand. She was surprised and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that, as far as he knew, she was constantly being cared for in her chambers, but it seemed that it was not enough for her. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was getting at. The Duke said she didn't need to check the glacier so often. He asked, "Didn't you last time?" She tried not, because she needed something. She said that everything was wrong. The Duke said that every time she came to his palace, she would scream if she didn't like something. He looked at her closely and said that servants had become bedridden after serving her. She smiled and said that she had to try even harder to make amends for the damage she had done to those people. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that she was very mysterious, and he would even be a little sorry when she left. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect to hear such a thing from the Duke. She looked at the Duke intently as she did not understand why he was behaving in this way. She froze in shock and wondered what was going on. The maids smiled and told the young lady that her wedding presents had just arrived and she should take a look at them. They smiled, and I happily said that the Marquise had sent her the sapphire personally, and it was very beautiful. Syria recalled the Duke's words with a joyful smile as she understood that she could handle everything. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she had prepared for her the bracelet she had spoken of earlier. She saw that the Marquis had given her a lot, and she wanted to repay him in kind by giving him a gift before the ceremony. The maid asked the lady if she was really going to give it to the Marquis. In the original, the saint found a mine of crystals, but until that happens, they will be considered precious stones. A moment later, a lady flew into the young lady's room and shouted that a disaster had occurred. She also screamed that the saint had fainted after touching the steel monument of the constellation. She said that the monument itself became transparent and began to shine. She screamed that they had a new stern. Syria was in shock and did not understand how something like this could happen. She understood perfectly well that they were now at the very beginning of history, and the saint had to awaken her powers later. A moment later, the Duke entered the room and asked how the saint was doing. The priest looked at the Duke intently and said that the worst was behind them and that they were lucky that the Marquise was nearby. Syria looked closely at the Marquis as she noticed that he didn't even notice her. The priest told the Duke that they had new stubble. He looked at the Duke intently and said that the saint would repay him for the kindness he had shown her. The Duke asked the lady if she had also suffered after awakening. Syria said that her power was not like that of a saint. The Duke asked in a rage whether the saint had intended to touch the steel and thereby raise a stir in his house. The young men backed away, not knowing what to answer the Duke. They said that the saint probably didn't realize that she was stubble, so she touched the monument without thinking. The Duke looked at the man with fury and asked if he had given her lessons. The Duke asked why she did that, and the man backed away and said that perhaps it was because she admired Syria. The young lady stood frozen in surprise and shock as she did not understand why the saint admired her. The man sighed heavily and said that it was his fault. The Duke looked at him intently, since at least he knew it. Syria wondered why the saint did this. She thought that the saint wanted to become Serna on purpose. Syria knew that books it happened by accident would have covered the power of the saint flared up so powerfully that it almost killed her. Syria knew that the truth about her essence had come to light in this way, and she was shocked because she knew that what had happened was different from what was written in the book. Lena screamed and told the Duke that the saint had woken up. The Duke said that was very good and they must go. Lena to the Duke that it would be a good idea if he took a look. The Duke asked angrily if he really looked like her nurse. Lena told the Duke that he had to do this to maintain good relations with the high priest. The Duke told Syria that they could visit the saint together since she was now Sterna. Callis screamed and called out for Lena. He was very worried about her. She looked at him intently, but did not answer as it was difficult for her to speak. Callis excitedly asked if she had taken the plunge. The saint quietly whispered that she was in great pain. Callis, holding the saint's hand, said that he was next to her and everything would be fine. Ebby quietly asked Syria if she should cut off the Marquis's hand, but the young lady did not answer. A moment later, the Duke called the Holy Father names. The Duke said angrily that as they could see, his house was full of events this winter. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that he no longer intended to keep this burden in his palace. Syria froze in place in surprise and wondered if the Duke had really called the saint a burden. The Duke told his assistant to write to the High Church that the saint would return there as soon as she could walk. Callis shouted at the Duke that these words were too much on his part since the saint had not planned to get sick. He didn't understand how anyone could call her a burden. The Duke looked at the Marquis with a grin and asked if he really couldn't express himself in his own house as he saw fit. Callis shouted that it was too rude of him because she was not disabled. The Duke told the young man that he, by the way, said these words because his relationship with his bride also could not be called healthy. The Duke looked at him closely and asked if he didn't think his priorities had shifted a little. The Duke said that people might think that his bride was a saint, and not Syria. Callis looked closely at the bride and called her. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling that she was going to cry soon. She understood perfectly well that she should be angry with the groom and not with the Duke. She never showed anger and endured everything steadfastly. Syria did everything to avoid the fate of the novel. The Duke said with a grin that they had not held a wedding for Sterna for a long time. The Duke said that the oath given to her must be kept as a sacred relic. The young lady sighed heavily as it was humiliating for her. She really wanted to go home. She wanted to live in peace. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and, holding out his hand, said that they must go. He looked at her intently and said that the Holy One needed rest. Callus hastily called his bride. But a moment later, the saint coughed and called him, and with the speed of lightning, the Marquis rushed towards the saint. The Duke slowly took the young lady by the hand and asked if she was coming. She sighed heavily and said that she was going with him. Some time later, the young lady came into the garden. She was thinking about everything that had happened. She remembered how her fiancé looked at the saint with trepidation and excitement, and he also said that everything would be fine with her because he was nearby. She was very angry because he hadn't said a word to her since yesterday. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around as the Duke called her. The Duke looked at the young lady with sadness on his face. She sighed heavily as she remembered that he had helped her, and she had never thanked him. He looked at her closely, asking if she could check the barrier properly after what happened yesterday. He looked at her closely, asking if she needed this as an excuse to get out of here. Why didn't she just move into the annex? Syria told the Duke something that he didn't need to worry about, as she had to carry out her duties diligently as always. She smiled and said that she would never neglect her duty. The Duke was taken aback and said that he had not meant it, but a moment later Callus called his bride. He looked at her intently and said that he had been wondering where to look for her, but she had been here all the time. The Duke looked at the young man with a grin and asked if he hadn't noticed him. The Marquis apologized for his rudeness and said that he could not find his bride anywhere because he had been looking for her all day. He looked at her intently and said that he had not expected to find them both here in such a secluded place. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place in shock. He looked closely at his bride and said that she should come with him because they had to talk. The Duke looked at the Marquis with cold fury and said that he had not given him permission to enter the vault. The Duke told the Marquis that no one but Sterna could come here without his permission. Callus said with a grin that when he returned to his lands, he would gladly repay the entire debt. Callus told the Duke that if he had a specific amount in mind, he could let him know. The Duke angrily told the Marquis that he had no right to choose his own punishment, and that it would be determined according to the traditions of his house. The Duke told the Marquis that he could have one of his hands cut off at the wrist. The Marquis grinned and told the Duke that he didn't know he needed his hand. The Marquis asked the Duke if he really wanted to start a war between their houses, and the Duke said that he was asking for trouble. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if they would go to war with Winter just to see who was braver. The Duke looked at the Marquis with fury and said that if he was seeking war, he would gladly answer the challenge. The Marquis looked at him intently and said with cold fury that it was only he who was seeking war. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening. She did not know what was happening and how she could get out of this situation. Syria told the Duke that her fiancé had been disrespectful, but they didn't need to start a war over such a trifle. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she begged him not to do this. She asked him to show the favor he had shown her. She said her fiancé would vow never to do anything so disrespectful again. The Duke looked at the Marquis with a grin and called him. As he was leaving, the Duke told the Marquis that he had the most beautiful bride, and the Marquis froze in shock. The young lady in turn was very happy as she understood that the trouble had passed. A moment later, the Marquis approached the young lady and said that they needed to talk. He shouted at her that she could not behave like that and that it was very immodest of her to grab the Duke by the clothes. He said that her disgusting and rude behavior was caused by simple anger. The young lady was shocked by his words. She turned around and asked if he meant to say that it was her rude behavior. He asked his bride to calm down because she knew that the saint was ill. He said that she had no one to rely on except him. He was shocked. He didn't understand why she behaved this way and why she spent time with another man right in front of his eyes. She said that he behaved the same way towards the saint. He shouted that these were different things because the saint was sick. The young lady cried out furiously that these were different things, but at least she did not call the Duke by his name in his presence. Syria told him to let her go, but the Marquis wanted her to listen to him for a little while. The young lady was furious, as she had already heard enough of her side. A moment later, she broke free from his grip. The Marquis was shocked by her action. She, breathing heavily, told him that she asked him to let her go. She looked at him with cold fury, barely holding back her tears. He was in shock and asked how he could pull his hand away like that after all it had hit a tree. She looked at him intently and said that if she were in his place, she would file for annulment of their engagement and ask for the saint's hand. The Marquis froze in place and asked what she was talking about. He was shocked by her words, and I screamed that his love is her. Syria asked who would believe a man who tenderly holds another woman's hand in front of his fiancée. Unlike the heroine, she did not fall in love with the Marquis Pucci, although she liked him, but she knew that he killed Syria in the original. She knew very well that he had taken his own life when he was rejected by the saint. She knew that the same fate awaited them. She hoped that since the main character had a happy ending, they could also enjoy happiness. She was afraid that they both might die again, and with tears in her eyes, she said that he knew nothing. She sighed heavily and said that he had no idea how scared she was every time she saw them together. The young lady looked at him intently, tears streaming down her face. He came closer to her and called her. He sighed heavily and said that he had not wanted to make her cry at all, and therefore asked her for forgiveness. A moment later, the young man exchanged his bride and said that it was all his fault. He looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that they could go to his estate as soon as the wedding was over. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he could swear to her that he would be a faithful husband. Syria wondered what would happen if she believed him, because she knew that if she believed she could avoid death, Syria, he should try not to be late for the wedding. He smiled and said that she had no reason to worry. Callis smiled tenderly and said that he would never do such a thing. The young lady sighed heavily but said nothing and looked at him with a smile. Callis looked closely at the saint and said that today was the last day they could call each other by name. She asked in surprise if this had anything to do with his fiancée. Lena said with a grin that the Viscount had already explained everything to her. With tears in her eyes, she asked if they would have to call each other Marquis and Saint from now on. Callis said that everything was true, and after the wedding they would hardly be able to see each other. The saint was shocked by this news because he was her dear friend. She said that it would be very nice if they could meet at least sometimes. The Marquis looked at her intently and called out she was taken aback, and said that she had never seen a bracelet on him before. The Marquis said that she was quite observant since it was a gift from his bride. Lena looked at the gift with fury. She said that she wished his bride all the best and would like to become friends with her. The Marquis said that according to etiquette, it is proper to call someone with whom he is not close enough by their last name. Lena was unhappy with what he said. She screamed with rage that she hated etiquette. She asked furiously if he understood how much she had to limit herself. She screamed that the Duke had said that she must return to the High Church. She screamed that she was afraid and sad that she had lost a friend like him. She asked him furiously if he had any idea how often her world had changed. She screamed that he was a liar because he said he would be her protector. Lena said with tears in her eyes that she was happy when she heard such words. The Marquis looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness, and also asked her not to cry anymore. Sometime later, they were sitting quietly by the bed. He looked at her intently and asked if she had calmed down at all. The saint sighed heavily and said that she would like to go to the Glacier. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was doing this. She said that now she was a stern and would be able to help Syria with her duties, and then their relationship could improve. Callis looked closely at the saint and said that he understood her feelings, but in her current state it was dangerous to do so. The saint looked at the young man with cold fury and told him to stop arguing with her because she would go there even alone. He looked at her intently, but did not answer, for he saw that she was determined. A moment later, he finally agreed with her as he knew she was a saint who was still under the protection of his house. He understood that if something happened to her, his family would be in trouble. Callis said they should do everything in just a short time. She smiled and agreed. Lennon told the Duke that all means of communication with the Marquis had been cut off and that they might have been caught in a severe snowstorm. The Duke was furious and asked his assistant if the Marquis really wanted his bride to die. The Duke was shocked by his behavior and thought he was simply crazy. Lennon said that perhaps they had been caught in a severe snowstorm and had simply lost their way, but that was no reason to put Mrs. Life at risk. The Duke said that when it came to a wedding, there was no room for stubble of any kind, but such things simply could not be taken so lightly. The Duke understood perfectly well that if all the conditions concerning time, place, and other rules were not fulfilled thoroughly, the power of the Sterna would flare up, and in the worst case, it would die itself. The Duke knew perfectly well that the Marquis was aware of the danger of the wedding, and yet he left just before the ceremony. The Duke was furious. He realized that he should have struck the Marquis and thrown him out of the estate. The Duke asked his assistant why the young lady was with the search party. He said that perhaps she was worried about the groom and wanted to go with them. The Duke thought for a moment because he noticed that in a year she had become a completely different person. As he left, the Duke said that it was very interesting. But a moment later, he told his assistant to tell the young lady that he forbade her to leave the palace. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled since she was not allowed to leave the palace. She knew that she had to find her groom before the ceremony. Ebby entered her room and said that they had been ordered to stop for the day. Ebby said the closer they got to the glacier, the more intense the blizzard became, and the search would resume at sunrise. Syria said she understood but was still worried, wondering if he would be able to come back. Ebby looked at the lady intently and said that the Duke had asked her to give her a message. The Duke looked at the knight intently and said that she must convey his words to the lady. The Duke said he would bring the bastard to the wedding hall even if he had to tie him up himself and return him there. He said that if she didn't hear from him by the day of the ceremony, she should continue preparing as if nothing had happened. The Duke said that no matter what happened, her wedding would go ahead as planned. Ebby sighed heavily and said, "Young lady," that these were the words of the Duke, and he was very angry. Syria didn't know why, but the High Church constantly emphasized the importance of punctuality. Ebby told the young lady with a smile that she did not need to worry, as the Duke had personally joined the search. The saint shouted to her knight that it was very dangerous outside. The Marquis was puzzled, since there was little time left before the wedding ceremony. The saint was surprised and asked why they didn't postpone it for a few days until everything calmed down. The Marquis sighed and said that he was afraid that it was simply impossible. If it was about the wedding of the Sterna, then nothing could be postponed. The saint was alarmed, but she looked at him and shouted that he could explain everything to her. But a moment later, the saint froze in place from shock. The Marquis said in shock that the wedding had already begun. Meanwhile, the young lady stood at the altar. Everyone was discussing the fact that the groom was not with the bride. Everyone hoped that the rumors about the Marquis and the saint were lies. The young lady stood quietly at the altar, listening to all the fuss. The priests got mixed up with each other. They were furious because they knew that it didn't matter now. They said that if things went on like this, her young lady's pig power gang would explode. Ebby looked at her peer with fury and asked what would happen if the Marquis did not come. A moment later, the young lady staggered at the altar. For a moment, she was taken aback and froze in shock because she did not understand what was happening. Ebby rushed towards the young lady, but she was stopped by the priests and told not to approach Syria. Ebby was furious because she wanted to help the lady, but she was told that if anyone touched the lady, her divine power would become even more all-consuming. The young lady was in shock because she thought she had escaped the bad ending, but death was on her heels. She was in shock. She didn't understand why everything happened like this. She wondered if it was all because Syria was a villain. She was in shock because all she wanted was love, and she wondered what she had done wrong. A moment later, everyone present was taken aback as they saw the Duke, who opened the doors with lightning speed. He moved towards the young lady with lightning speed, but everyone present shouted that he must not touch her. The Duke looked at the young lady intently, and lifting her from the ground said that she must pull herself together. He looked at her closely and said that he knew she didn't want to die because it would be unfair. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want that. With tears in her eyes, the young lady said that such a death was too pitiful for her. The Duke was taken aback and froze for a moment, but after a few seconds she let go of his hand. A few seconds later, the Duke told the priest to prepare everything for the wedding ceremony. He looked at them with fury and said that the young lady's wedding must take place as planned. He said that she would be saved. The young lady ran away in fear because she wanted to live, so she begged for mercy. She heard someone calling her, and opening her eyes, she clearly saw the Duke in front of her who was calling her. She looked at him in bewilderment, but many people only smiled and said that she remained beyond his understanding. He looked at her intently and asked what kind of dream could have brought her to tears. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she had really been crying. Rush said that that was exactly it, otherwise he would not have woken her up. She held it, sighed, and asked if it was really him calling her by name. The Duke said that it was true, and also asked what she had dreamed about. Syria said with a smile that she had dreamed of death and that she was dying. He looked at her intently and asked if she was afraid of death. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked who was not afraid of it. The Duke looked at her with a tender smile and said that after all her scandalous antics, he considered that death was not a fear for her. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke in bewilderment but did not answer. A moment later she asked the Duke what had happened to her fiancé. He didn't answer her and only with lightning speed straightened her towel. She consoled him and asked in surprise what he was doing. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had amnesia. He looked at her intently and asked if she really didn't remember what happened at the ceremony. Rush said he made his vows to her at the ceremony. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if they had really become husband and wife. The Duke said that everything was correct and the head of the House of Burke could not allow his family to be dishonored by losing Stern. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if he knew that she could die before the ceremony. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. Rush said that Stern's wedding is supposed to be a strict affair, and to avoid the worst-case scenario, it is customary not to tell them about it. He looked at her closely and said that their betrothed were always notified as they too would be in danger if the ceremony was interrupted, as the divine power of the Sterna would then be released. Syria looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he really meant that Callus knew about this. She asked if he really knew that she would die if he was late. Callus ran into the estate in a hurry. The maid shouted at him that he should not go into the young lady's room, but he did not listen to anyone. He ran into the room and looked at the young lady, intently calling her name, but she only looked at him with fury. The maid was taken aback because she knew that the Duke had ordered that no one should be allowed into the mistress's bedroom. Syria looked closely at everyone present and asked them to leave them alone because she and the Marquis needed to discuss something. The Marquis looked at her with fury and asked how she could do such a thing. He was shocked and did not understand how she could marry another man and a duke at that. The young lady in turn did not want to tolerate this. She angrily hit him in the face. She looked at him intently and said coldly that he didn't come to the ceremony. Syria looked at him and said that she married another man solely because of him. Syria was furious. She screamed that if it were not for the Duke, she would have died a terrible and painful death due to the fault of her fiancé. She looked at him intently and said that, judging by his expression, he was curious about how she knew such information. She was furious because she knew that he himself was aware of the fact that she could die if he was late for the wedding, but he still decided to do otherwise. She looked at him intently and asked with a grin if this was really what he was after. She asked if this was really the reason he had gone out for a walk with the saint. The Marquis was very much puzzled. He told the young lady to listen to him, as they were simply caught in a snowstorm. With lightning speed, he fell to his knees and screamed at her that he simply had no choice. He screamed that he was terribly worried about her, and even during the snowstorm he tried to get to her, but suddenly lost consciousness. Bursting into tears, he said that she should not doubt because she was the only woman he wanted to marry, and all his words were spoken from the heart. With the speed of lightning, the Marquis took the young lady by the hand and said that he really loved her very much. Syria froze in place for a moment. She was stunned as some kind of power emanated from the Marquis. She was taken aback and looked at him intently and also wondered why he was still alive. She understood perfectly well that his powers should have exploded like hers. As payment for breaking the oath, she was dumbfounded on the spot because she could not believe what had happened. Callus took part in the ceremony. At the moment he vowed to marry Syria, thereby tying himself to the Sterns as a whole, meaning that he could theoretically marry anyone. He found himself in a situation where all the conditions were met. The presence of a wedding ceremony, time and place. She was well aware that there was another Sterna in the data on the possessions. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he had married a saint. The Marquise rose up with lightning speed and looked intently at the lady, who angrily took her hand away from him, for she believed that this was so since he was alive. She understood perfectly well that one would humiliate himself so much just to avoid repeating the fate of Syria from the book. She sighed heavily and said that she had fallen in love with him not long ago, but now regretted that she had wasted a lot of time. The young lady was in shock because her chest suddenly felt tight. She was constantly careful so that Callus would not be upset. The Marquis was furious. He shouted that this was only a temporary marriage like hers with the Duke. He shouted that they needed them so that they could survive. The young lady looked at him with fury and asked what was wrong with him. She was furious because she knew that her beautiful and submissive behavior had ruined the bride in another way. He looked at her intently and said that they could divorce them and marry each other. The Marquis shouted that they could start all over again because they still had time. Syria asked angrily if it was just a matter of time. She looked at the Marquis intently and said that her feelings for him had long since disappeared. The Marquis froze in place from the slag. A moment later, the young lady was walking away from him. In a hurry, the Marquis did not want to let her go and shouted for her to stop. The Marquis, with the speed of lightning, seized the young lady by the hand and called her. She looked at him intently and told him to let her go. Syria told him that the power of another sternum was coming from him, and she felt it. She screamed that it was disgusting, so he should not touch her. The Marquis was taken aback and froze in place from shock. He looked at her hard and said that she must listen to him first. But a moment later, the Duke came up to them and said that the young lady had told him to let her go. The Duke looked at the stamp with fury and asked if he was also deaf on top of everything else. Callus looked at the Duke with fury but did not answer. The Duke looked closely at the young lady as he noticed that her wound had opened. She sighed heavily and said that it had opened a little too early. The Duke said anxiously that it was not a little at all, and they would immediately follow the priest and he would provide assistance. The Marquis looked at the Duke intently and said that he could take her to the priest himself. The Duke looked at the Marquis with fury and asked why he would do such a thing. Callus said that they had not finished their conversation yet. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and said that she must decide for herself. He looked intently at the Marquis and said that she would now decide and say who would accompany her to the priest. The young lady hugged her husband with lightning speed and the Marquis froze in shock. Syria looked at the Duke with a gentle smile and said that she owed him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. As he left, he looked at her with a smile and asked if such words were unnecessary between spouses. The Duke looked hard at his subordinate and told him to call the priest into his office. The Marquis in turn froze in shock and stared after them. The priest looked closely at the young lady and asked her to refrain from any active movements, and after the treatment he said that he would take his leave so that she could rest. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she was feeling better. The lady froze in place for a moment. Rush looked at her intently and asked if she was not going to answer the question. A moment later, the young lady rose up and knelt before the Duke. She sighed heavily and said that she knew she was a little late, but she wanted to thank him for saving her. The Duke in turn was taken aback because he did not understand why she did this. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had hit her head. Syria looked at him in surprise and said that her head was fine. Rush asked worriedly what was the matter. Then she smiled and said that she had only just now finally come to her senses. She smiled and said that she wanted to thank him for saving her. She understood perfectly well that she owed her life to the main character, the man she considered the most terrible in this world. She looked at him intently and with her gentle smile said that she was sincerely grateful to him. The Duke in turn froze in surprise on the spot. She was well aware that he had held his first wedding to save her. She smiled and said that she had done it all she could to repay the kindness he had shown her. She understood that the first marriage of the Duke of the Empire had been with her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that for that reason she wished very much that he would not worry too much. She looked away from him and said she would try not to ruin his marriage prospects. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He smiled and said that it was the first time he had heard a woman say something like that, and he had never known that a woman was bothered by such things. Syria said that even if he married 2, 3, or more times, he would still not stop inflaming women's hearts. He asked in surprise if she really thought he was a lecher, and the young lady cried out in embarrassment that this was not the case at all. Syria looked at him intently and said that she very much hoped that she had not offended him, and she also said that she intended to spend all her energy on the good of his estate for as long as their marriage lasted. The Duke froze in surprise for a moment as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was watching his reaction so closely. He wanted to know if he scared her. She smiled and said that he didn't, but she knew that the way he was described in the book terrified her. Rush looked at the young lady with his gentle smile and said that in any case he would look forward to her contribution to the well-being of the house. She looked at him intently, confusion on her face, but a moment later, with a joyful smile, she said that she would do everything in her power to live up to his expectations. Sometime later, Saria came to the dungeon to see her knight, and Ebby joyfully asked the young lady if she was okay. Abby, surprised and smiling, asked the lady how she knew that she was behind bars. Saria said that the Duke told her everything, but now it was not important. She was shocked and did not understand what made Abby challenge the Knights of Callus. Saria shouted at the defender, who considered it disrespectful. Ebby sighed heavily and said that she only challenged them to a duel. Ebby said that she had to clench all her patience into a fist to refrain from challenging the Marquis himself. The young lady sighed heavily, but did not answer. Saria looked closely at her protector and asked her to do something about her character. The knight commander looked at them intently and said that Abigail had not challenged them to a knightly duel, but rather to a fierce fight. Elliot looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had barely escaped expulsion from the Empire. Elliot looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not need to worry because, thanks to the Duke's mercy, she would be released in a couple of days. The young lady was amazed. She asked with a smile how she could repay him for such kindness. Elliot smiled and told the young lady that Abigail was the debtor, and not her. Saria smiled happily and said that her protector was a true knight, so she always paid back her debts. Ebby looked at them and asked how long they were going to stand there. Sometime later, they were slowly returning. At the estate, the young lady was worried. She wondered if it was too cold in the prison, as she was worried that her protector might freeze to death. Elliot looked at her puzzled and asked if she really thought that was possible. The young lady said that she was very worried about her protector. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was serious. Elliot said that her protector was one of those people who would always find a way out, even if they found themselves in a glacier. He could not understand how the young lady managed to find such a hardy escort. Saria said that as soon as her protector was free, she would bring her hot beef soup and give her the best and thickest cloak she could find, and she also thought that her protector needed to live in her quarters for a while. Elliot laughed heartily after her words. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was laughing. He looked at her with a smile and said that now he realized what the Archduke had seen in her. Saria looked at the commander of the knights in surprise and asked if he was really talking about the formidable Duke now. She suddenly froze because she remembered how he told her that she would not die because he believed that she should not die so unfairly. She remembered him smiling and saying that he would look forward to her contribution to the well-being of the house. The lady froze in embarrassment, wondering if the Duke really thought she was interesting. A moment later, Lennon came up to them, breathing heavily, and said that he saw that they were both enjoying a pleasant conversation. They looked at Lennon with puzzlement as he was not in his best shape. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked how he was feeling since he had no face. Lennon sighed heavily and said that he didn't feel at all. Lennon looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and dumped a lot of problems on her. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was the cause of all his troubles. He looked at the young lady intently and said that of course it was nothing compared to her work of checking the glacier. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Lennon, looking at the lady, said that another mistress of the house would have dealt with such things with him, but she was still very weak and her marriage to the Duke had not yet been approved, so he would have to cope on his own. Saria looked closely at the young man as she could see that he was worried that she might feel guilty. She was surprised, but at the same time glad that the servants of the house were very kind to her. The young lady thanked him with a smile. He looked at her intently and said sheepishly that the end-of-year celebration was coming up soon, and she needed to get ready. She smiled and said that of course she would take care of everything. A few days later, the young lady was glowing with beauty. Begonia smiled and said that the young lady suited her current image very well. Saria looked at Begonia with a puzzled expression and asked if she thought the image was too ornate, but she said that the young lady would soon become a duchess, so such a level of pomp was possible. Saria said the Duke had married her only to save her. Begonia said she had known cases where gestures of goodwill had ended up being fateful. A moment later, they heard someone knocking on the door. A maid slowly entered the young lady's room and, trembling, announced that she had a visitor. A moment later, the saint entered the room in a hurry and asked the young lady to speak to her. Begonia was in shock. She wondered if the saint had gone mad. The young lady sighed heavily and asked everyone to leave them as she wanted to talk to the saint. She looked closely at the saint and said that she wanted to hear what she had to say. Syria looked closely at the saint and said that now they were alone, she asked her what she wanted to tell her. The saint timidly asked the young lady not to blame Callus too much. The saint looked at the young lady intently and said that she was simply pestering him with stories about how she wanted to go to the glacier, and there they were suddenly caught in a snowstorm. Syria looked closely at the saint and asked if she didn't know that the marks were from her fiancé. The saint sighed heavily and said that she knew about it, but he was a very dear friend to her. Lena sighed heavily and said that she wanted to create one last memory with him. Syria looked at the saint and asked if they would never see each other again, since this was now her last memory of him. The saint was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Syria sighed heavily as she knew that she ended up bullying the saint just like in the book. The saint burst into tears and told the young lady that she only wanted to be friends with her. Syria sighed heavily and asked the saint if she really thought that a former and current wife could become friends. The saint looked at her in surprise and asked why not. Syria looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lena looked at the lady intently and said that they were not officially married. Syria said that it was their business and did not concern her. A moment later, a maid entered the room and told the lady that it was time for them to go. The saint looked closely at the young lady and said that she had really hoped that they could become closer. The saint looked closely at the young lady and said that her mother was not a commoner who became an aristocrat. The young lady in turn froze in place, rooted to the spot by her words. Lenin, looking at the Duke, said that if his memory served him right, the lady had fainted at her last wedding, and after the severe loss of blood he was in shock and did not understand why the Duke did not forbid her to overwork. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his assistant how one could interfere with someone who sincerely wanted to work. The Duke sighed heavily. He understood that it would be better for her to be busy with something than to sit and be sad. He did not want her to give in to emotions and empty thoughts. He looked closely at his assistant and asked in surprise why he suddenly began to worry about her well-being. The young man was taken aback because he did not expect such a question. A moment later, he shouted that he was not indifferent to those who quickly and efficiently perform their duties. Lenin asked the Duke if he knew how soon they were preparing for the end-of-year celebration. He said it was only thanks to the lady that he could sit in his office and leisurely look through documents an hour before the ball. Lenin looked at the gentleman and asked what had fascinated him so much. Lenin read that Burke had invited a magician from the kingdom to drive out the demons from Laurel's estate. Lenin looked at the gentleman intently and said that he understood that this would be his last visit to the estate. He also asked the Duke if he would take the lady with him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he believed he must do so. Even though their union was temporary, they were still husband and wife. Lenin looked at the gentleman intently and said that he would be looking forward to hearing how the demons would behave when they saw their mistress. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he himself was interested. Lenin looked at the Duke and asked where he was going. The Duke sighed heavily and said that the reception would start soon. He looked at his subordinate intently and said with a smile on his face that it would be heartless of him not to accompany his wife. Sometime later, the Duke was slowly walking towards his wife when suddenly he froze for a moment. He looked at the Marquis in surprise and asked what he was doing there. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that he had come here for the saint. The Duke looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked why she was here. The Marquis looked at him intently and said that he himself did not know. A moment later, the Marquis asked the Duke when he planned to annul the marriage. Callus told the Duke that he was deeply grateful for saving the young lady's life, and he would repay him in full from his house. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that it was very surprising, but he also asked why he would suddenly pay his wife's debt. The Marquis was shocked by this. The Duke looked closely at the young man and asked if he had any connection with her. The Marquis looked at the Duke with fury and said that he seriously intended to divorce the saint. The Marquis said that he had received the Marquis's official consent to marry his daughter. He looked at the Duke intently and asked if he had written to the Seria family. The Duke looked at him with fury. The Duke understood perfectly well that he entered into this marriage to save her, because he could not have time to take into account all aspects. He knew that the blame for what happened lay entirely with the Marquis. He looked closely at the marks from the attacks, not understanding how he dared to say such a thing to him now. As he left, the Duke said that for a man who had put his bride's life at risk, he was too talkative. The Marquis was in shock. He shouted to the Duke, but after a few seconds they both became alert. As they heard a noise, the maid, taken aback, called for her mistress. A few minutes ago, the saint asked the young lady if her mother was not a commoner who became an aristocrat. Syria remembered how everyone in high society would whisper and say that no matter how beautiful she was, her mother was just an ordinary low-class aristocrat. She knew that in the book she had only mentioned it once, but Syria had reacted very violently to such words. It would be more correct to say that she had become furious like a mad bull. Syria understood perfectly well that she was just in her body, but still it was unpleasant for her to hear something like this. The saint, with a joyful smile, told the young lady that she liked her parents. Syria noticed that she couldn't control her anger when she was around the members of the Escalating house, or when she heard her mother mention the saint would smile and say that even though her mother was a commoner, she was the same as them. The saint looked at the young lady in surprise because she did not understand why her face suddenly changed. Syria raised her hand in anger to hit. It was at such moments that the young lady seemed to become Syria herself. Everyone present froze in place for a moment in shock. The saint turned away, preparing for the blow, but she was taken aback and opened her eyes as she felt no pain. Lena looked at the young lady who had slapped herself in the face in surprise. Lena looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. Syria looked at the saint with fury and asked how she knew about such a thing. The saint was taken aback and, trembling, said that her teacher had told her about it. Syria looked at her intently and asked if she was talking about the Viscount. Syria looked closely at the saint and asked if her wise teacher had told her that she hated it when such things were mentioned, or that discussing personal family histories was considered a grave insult. Syria knew very well that if something like this had happened a couple of days ago, she would have done everything in her power to escape, but now she was furious and wondered how long she had to continue to go out of her way for them. She knew that the Marquis and the saint had deceived her, and yet she continued to endure this. She understood perfectly well that she was the villain here. Syria, in turn, wondered why she shouldn't be evil. A moment later, she approached the saint and said that no matter how much the Marquis repeated that their marriage was temporary, they remained the Marquis and the saint. Syria looked at the saint intently and said that people in such a position cannot speak out loud, whatever comes into their heads, disgracing those around them, and even more so, they should not refer to the fact that it is difficult for them to understand something. As she left, the young lady told the saint that she was not a baby at all. Syria told the saint that she should be more sensible since she occupied a high position in society. The young lady, in turn, was furious. She did not know whether she should go and tell the priest all the words of the saint. She was furious that the saint had insulted her, but she still wondered if he would do anything about it. She knew that her word would not change the fact that she was a villain. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew she had to go back because Begonia was also in shock now. With lightning speed, she turned around and walked to the side, but suddenly bumped into a young man. The Duke caught the young lady by the hand and asked angrily what was happening to her. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to see him at all. Syria looked at the Duke in surprise and asked why he was there. She wondered if he had come for her. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked what kind of questions she was asking. He looked at her intently and said that he had been following her since she left the room. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he thought he was walking loudly enough to attract attention. She smiled and said that it seemed like her thoughts had distracted her from the real world. The Duke looked at her intently but said nothing. A moment later, he moved closer to her and looked intently into her face. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to tell him. He sighed heavily and said that it was like a mark that was left on others after interacting with her in the past. Syria was taken aback for a moment and wondered how he knew. She smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that he was right and she had hit herself because she and Madame Lena had argued. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Syria smiled and said that nothing like that happened. She hoped that he didn't come for this. She looked intently at the Duke since she did not want to talk about her mother at all now. The Duke turned around with lightning speed and told the young lady that they needed to go out and get some fresh air before going into the hall as they needed to cool her cheek. The young lady looked after him intently as she understood that he was not interested in the details. A moment later he stopped and asked in surprise if she was really not going. She smiled and said that of course she was coming. She wondered if that was really how he was expressing his concern. The Marquis was taken aback and looked intently at the young men, and he also called Saria. He froze for a moment when he saw the Duke with the young lady. The Marquis looked at the young lady with cold fury and called her again, but all in vain. Some time later the young lady was sitting outside with the Duke. She was looking at him intently with a smile on her face. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she did not stop looking at him so intently. The young lady was taken aback and stood there in embarrassment because she did not know what to answer him. In turn, she wondered if he had not just been sitting with his eyes closed. Saria looked at the Duke intently and said that he might stain his white clothes. The Duke looked at her in surprise but said nothing. The Duke looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that sometimes he wanted to look into her head and see what was going on there. Saria was taken aback as she didn't expect to hear something like that. He smiled and said that her thoughts were chaotic. He said with a smile that he would be very sad if her outfit was ruined. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment. She hurriedly asked the Duke if he liked her outfit, because Begonia had recommended that she wear this outfit today, because it seemed to her that the dress she had chosen would not suit. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She was puzzled because she did not know why he was looking at her so vulgarly. A moment later the Duke said sheepishly that they had to go since the reception had already begun, and the young lady ran after him with a smile. She looked closely at the Duke as he took off and asked if the Marquis had gone to the annex. The Duke looked at her sideways and asked why she was asking such a thing. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing how to answer his question correctly. But a moment later she said she thought she smelled his perfume. Saria said the Marquis likes to wear a certain perfume at events. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really talking about his perfume now. Saria said with an innocent smile that the perfume was quite unusual, which is why she remembered it. She looked at the Duke in surprise as his face changed. Saria asked the Duke if she had really insulted him. The Duke in turn did not answer her question and said that they needed to hurry because they might be late. Rush in turn was a little puzzled by the young lady's words. He wondered if she really liked the Marquis so much that she even remembered his perfume. Sometime later they walked quietly to the reception. At the same time the Marquis and the Saint were present at the reception. Everyone was whispering, looking at the young people. The ladies said that the Marquis and the Saint were simply shameless. The Saint sighed heavily and told the Marquis that she felt awkward and would like to leave the reception. The Marquis looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was going to tell what had happened to her Saria. The Saint froze for a moment after his question. A moment later, Lena casually looked away from the Marquise and said that she only came to apologize to the young lady, but she made a scene. She looked at the Marquis with cold fury and said that he did not want to think about it anymore, so he should stop remembering such things. Rush and Saria entered the room. Everyone present looked intently at the young people. They said that Saria was simply charming. Everyone present looked intently at the young lady because they knew that she would be the star of the evening. Lena in turn looked at Saria with fury. Rush looked closely at the young lady and asked why a saint was present at the celebration. He wondered if she had canceled their invitation. Saria looked at him puzzled and asked how she justified it. Rush said that there were a lot of reasons and she could have chosen anyone. Saria sighed heavily and said that they deserved to be no less than her. She also said that she is not the star of the evening, as everyone around her says. The Duke looked at her intently but said nothing. A moment later he asked who, if not she. The young lady thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She sighed heavily and said that in their presence she felt like a third wheel, and the saint froze for a moment in shock. The Viscount looked intently at the saint and called her. The Viscount looked at her intently and, irritated, asked if he hadn't told her not to come to Madame Cerie for a while. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if she really enjoyed humiliating herself. Saria said, puzzled, that she said that she could not look at things any other way. Rush looked at her intently and said to us more seriously that this reception was for her, not for them. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she would do him the honor, since according to tradition, the ball should be opened by the stars of the evening. The young lady froze in embarrassment for a moment but still accepted his invitation. A few minutes later they were twirling around in a dance. The saint looked closely at the young people and asked her teacher why only they were dancing. The Viscount said that his lordship was a very highly titled person and that he had been on the same level with the imperial family since time immemorial. The saint looked at them in surprise and asked, "What about her and the Marquis?" The Viscount hesitated for a moment, but after a few seconds told the saint that her status was Soul Temple. He looked at her intently and said that in the Empire there was a clear line between the aristocrats and the imperial family. The saint sighed heavily, and watching the young people closely said that she understood everything. A moment later the servant told the Viscount that the Marquis was looking for him. The Viscount bowed to the saint with lightning speed and said that he would step away for a few minutes. The young saint did not even notice that the Viscount had left her. She was looking intently at the young men, as it was assumed that it would be better on the other side. After some time her Naledi went out onto the terrace and asked the knight not to let anyone in. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the stars because she knew that it was impossible to know in advance what the future had in store. She looked into the distance with a soft smile because she knew that a couple of days ago she was supposed to become a marquise. She understood perfectly well that if her wedding with the marquise had gone smoothly, then everything would have been different. But she wondered whether she would have been able to avoid the sad ending and live peacefully. It seemed to her that the Marquise's feelings were real, but he still could not separate himself from the saint as it was in the book. She wondered if this meant that the others would also stick to the main plot. She remembered the Duke saying behind a bright smile that this reception was just for her. She sighed heavily and smiled because she didn't even want to think about it. But a moment later she was taken aback and turned around with lightning speed because she heard the voice of the saint. The saint looked intently at the young lady and invited her to finish their conversation. The Duke looked at his secretary and asked if he had seen the young lady. Lena said he was sure she had gone to the terrace. He was surprised and did not understand, since when the Duke had been calling her by name, the Duke asked if he was really talking about the Duchess's terrace now. Lena remembered with a smile how the young lady screamed that she had no right to enter the Duchess's terrace, but he smiling said that she would just look around and nothing bad would happen. He smiled and said that for a very long time it had been locked. He did not even care what kind of marriage they had, temporary or not, but he decided to take the opportunity to open it again. A moment later, he was taken aback and asked the Duke if it was not too presumptuous of him to close it back, but the Duke said that there was no need to do that. The Duke smiled and said that the young lady rarely had time to be alone here. He knew there was no harm in giving her such an opportunity. He looked closely at all the guests and noticed the Marquis, who was hurriedly looking for someone. Syria looked at the saint in surprise and informed her that this was the Duchess's terrace and even the Duke could not enter here. The saint looked closely at the young lady and informed her that she had asked the Marquis for a divorce. Syria in turn looked intently at the saint but did not answer. Lena said that she heard that it is as difficult for a woman to get divorced as it is to get married. She said that most likely everything will not work out right away. With lightning speed, the saint took the young lady by the hand and said that she promised to return to her what she had taken. Syria looked at the saint with cold fury and said that it seemed she had misunderstood something. Syria said that it did not matter to her whether divorce or death separated her from the Marquis. It would not change anything because she no longer had feelings for the Marquis. Syria sighed heavily and asked the saint what she needed. Lena was puzzled. She shouted that she didn't need anything from her. Syria slowly approached the door, but suddenly froze for a moment as she felt the Marquis approaching. The saint shouted angrily that she knew she was not important here. The Marquis froze in place when he heard her words. The saint looked at the young lady intently and shouted that in her presence she felt like a third wheel. Syria froze in shock on the spot as she had said those words earlier. She looked closely at the saint because she knew that these words were a repetition because she had said them to the Duke earlier. Syria was surprised and did not understand why the saint said them now because she never intended to oppose the saint. Syria looked closely at the saint and said that the Marquis was now behind the door. Syria knew and understood that in this story, the main character was a saint. She did not want to have anything to do with her and only asked for the opportunity to live a full life. Syria looked at the saint closely and said that she was sure that she saw the marquise from the place where she was standing now. Syria was a little surprised because she did not understand why the saint said such a thing. Syria in turn understood perfectly well that the saint continued to manipulate everyone. Syria looked at the saint with cold fury and asked if she really wanted the marquis to hear such a thing. Syria asked the saint if she really wanted him to believe in her sincerity. Syria looked at the saint intently and asked if she really wanted to make her look bad. Lena hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The young lady, in turn, wondered if she was destined to remain a villain forever. Syria looked closely at the saint and asked why she treated her like this, since she had never done anything bad to her. A moment later, the young lady turned around with lightning speed and said that since the saint refused to leave, she would do it for her. Lena rushed towards the young lady with lightning speed as she wanted to stop her. But a moment later, there was a loud roar, and the saint froze in place in shock. Syria turned around but noticed that the saint had disappeared, and all that was left of her was a small shoe. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening. For a moment, the marquise and the young lady stood stunned by what had happened. Syria was shocked. She didn't understand how this was possible because the young lady just disappeared. The marquis flew up to the young lady with lightning speed and asked furiously if she had really pushed the saint down. Syria was taken aback for a moment and froze in place in shock. Syria looked at the marquis in confusion and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, a knight approached them and asked the marquis how he could say such a thing. Syria sighed heavily, and with tears in her eyes asked the marquis if he really intended to follow her from behind until the very end. The marquis was taken aback and shouted to the young lady that this was not what he had meant at all. But a moment later, they froze in shock as they saw the saint floating in the air, enveloped in power and light. Syria looked closely at the saint, because she had just become convinced that she was right. She knew that in this book the saint had left and returned from her world to theirs several times. The saint looked closely at the marquis and called him. A moment later, the marquis deftly caught Lena. She was quietly sobbing on his shoulder. Callus was surprised and puzzled. He wanted to know if the saint was okay and what had happened. Syria looked at them intently as she did not expect that this would be the first time this would happen this evening. In turn, the saint was screaming and asking for help. The marquis was surprised and puzzled by such behavior. The saint screamed and asked her to calm down. Syria looked at the saint intently, and in surprise she remembered that according to the plot, the saint would disappear from this world for the second time for a whole year. Syria understood perfectly well that it didn't matter, and it didn't concern her at all. She was puzzled because she could never have thought that the marquis would consider her a murderer with the speed of lightning. She turned around and walked towards the exit. The marquis called the young lady and said that he had misspoken. He looked at her intently and asked her not to do anything like that. But the young lady in turn did not want to have anything to do with them anymore. She strode towards the exit with lightning speed. The marquis shouted after her, but it was all in vain. The young lady was furious. She understood perfectly well that since she had gotten the body of an incorrigible villain, she had done everything in order to survive because it was difficult for her to save her reputation, which had sunk to the very bottom. She understood perfectly well that even if she had failed to correct all the bad deeds of the previous series, Callus could not help but notice the good that she had done in order to repent. The young lady was puzzled because she was very happy when he proposed to her. Then it seemed to her that she had finally been rewarded for all her efforts. The young lady in turn could not even imagine that in one moment all her efforts would be put to waste, even though in the end he chose the saint and left her at the threshold of death. The young lady in turn was furious because she heard how the man who had become attached to her and talked about love said such things. He suspected her of the saint's disappearance, and then she realized that everything she had done was a waste of time. She was furious because she realized that she had simply tried in vain. A moment later, the Duke came up to her and called her as he saw that she was upset about something. The young lady sighed heavily and said with a timid smile that she always appeared before him in such a form. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a smile that everything was exactly like that in him and he constantly finds her. The lady sighed heavily without looking up. She timidly asked the Duke if he had heard everything. He looked at her intently and said that the Marquis and the Saint had spoken loudly enough. The Duke looked intently at the young lady. He said nothing to her, only gently touched her face. A moment later he said in a soft voice that she was about to cry. Syria sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. The Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady, waiting patiently and not saying a word. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she felt like she was going to cry. Syria looked at Lennon in surprise and asked if the high priest had taken the saint away. Lennon said that was exactly the case because the high priest was angry and took her away. The young lady in turn knew the high priest very well, and knew also that he was stern, but he was not one to get angry. Syria asked the young man if he had really come to her chambers so early to discuss such matters. Lennon was taken aback and said that it seemed the Duke had not yet spoken to her about one matter. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what business he was talking about. Lennon looked at her intently and asked if she had by any chance heard of Laurel's estate. A moment later, the Marquis burst into her room and asked her to give him a little time before leaving. He looked at her intently and said that he begged her to do so. Lennon looked at the Marquis with bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked if he hadn't noticed him. The Marquis, without looking at the young man, coldly said that he could decide for himself whether to leave or stay in the room. Lennon was stunned by such an answer. Callus dropped to his knees in front of the young lady with lightning speed. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. He said that he understood perfectly well that an apology would not heal the wounds that he had inflicted on her. He sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she could give him another chance. Syria called the Marquis with cold fury and asked what would change if they started all over again. She looked at the Marquis with cold fury and asked if he was sure he would not go to the saint if she called him again. The Marquis was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. He repeated something incoherently. But after a few seconds, the young lady said with fury that he would not go, but would run as soon as the saint called his name. Syria looked at him intently and asked what he had asked yesterday. A moment later, she repeated his question because then he wanted to know if she had pushed the saint off the balcony. Syria looked at him with fury and said that even a knight had not thought of such a thing, and only one Marquis doubted her innocence. The young lady sighed heavily and said that of course she could understand why he would think of her since her reputation was rather dubious, and besides he had almost lost his arm because of her. Syria sighed heavily and stood up from the sofa with lightning speed. She said that she was fed up with his apologies as he had deeply wounded her. The young lady in turn was against Togo continuing to suffer in order to avoid a tragic death. She looked at him with anger and said that she did not want to worry forever about whether he would run to the saint again or not. She did not want to justify all the absurd situations that were in the plot of the book. From that moment on, she refused to be afraid. She looked at him intently and said that everything was over between them, and the lady also threw away his ring, which he had given her earlier with lightning speed. The Marquis froze in shock on the spot because he did not expect such a thing. As she was leaving, the young lady told Lennon that they could finish their conversation outside, and the young man rushed after his lady with lightning speed. Callus sat silently on his knees staring at the ring in front of him. A moment later, he couldn't take it anymore and burst into tears as he was very sorry that everything happened this way. The young lady looked at the young man intently and asked what he was going to tell her yesterday. Lennon looked at her intently, asked if she really thought he should tell her about it. Now she was surprised, looked at him and asked why not. Lennon sighed heavily and said that he somehow didn't feel like it, but to disturb the one who had just gone through a breakup and she probably stabbed herself with sobs. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not so, and she had not cried at all, and in general she told the Marquis what had been on her mind for a long time. She sighed heavily and asked what he wanted to tell her. A moment later, the young man began to tell her. The young lady, in turn, did not listen to him as she was distracted. She looked closely at her protector and greeted her with a joyful smile. Syria, with the speed of lightning, rushed to her protector because she understood that she had been through a lot. Ebby told the lady with a smile that nothing special had happened and everything was fine with her. Syria looked at her protector closely and handed her the cloak. It was the thickest cape she had ever worn. Ebby smiled and told her mistress that it was not necessary. Syria, in turn, knew perfectly well that the prison was too cold. She told her defender to immediately go to the kitchen and eat hot stew. Evie smiled and said that it was not so cold there, compared to the fact that she spent several days in icy water. Ebby asked the lady angrily if she had decided which of the two she wanted to kill. The young lady was taken aback and said that there was no need to kill anyone. Abby looked at the lady and said that she was very sorry and also asked if she could deal with them. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would be sentenced to death. Abby said that she would act discreetly. Elliot looked at her and said that there were many prying ears around and she should watch her words. Lennon couldn't help but cry out as he wanted them to listen to him. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the young man intently, and she also said that she was listening to him attentively. He looked at her intently and said that he had something extremely important to tell her. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to hear something like that. Lennon said that in the Burke estate there is a place very famous in certain circles. He looked at the young lady intently and said that such a place was the Laurel estate, but she had hardly heard of it, but nevertheless she would go there with the Duke tomorrow. The young lady in turn knew perfectly well that only the closest relatives of the Burke family could stay at this estate, and in the novel it was mentioned in a couple of lines, and in them they said that everyone had forgotten about this place. She wondered if she had to go there tomorrow. The young man looked at her intently and asked her in a puzzled tone if she had any plans by any chance. She looked at him intently and said that she had no plans. The young man sighed heavily, because he was finally able to tell her everything he understood, that the Duke had not managed to meet with her. He looked at her closely and said that she must be confused to suddenly learn that she would have to set out tomorrow, but he still asked her to prepare for the trip, and the young lady said with a smile that she would do everything. But she in turn was puzzled because the next day they set out on their journey. Syria is very excited and confused and also embarrassed because she didn't understand what was going on at all. She looked at the Duke with confusion since no one had warned her about this. He looked at her intently and said that she could try to sleep because they had a long journey ahead of them. She was in shock and didn't understand how she could fall asleep in such a position. An hour earlier, the Duke had come for the young lady and informed her that it was time for them to set out before the snowstorm got any worse. But when he entered the room, he noticed that she was sleeping soundly. The Duke looked intently at the young lady. The maid said in a hurry that she would immediately wake the lady and help her get ready. The Duke sighed heavily and told the maid that she should not do that. A moment later, he came closer to the young lady. With lightning speed, he took the young lady in his arms. He told the maid that it seemed that she was sleeping peacefully for the first time in a long time. For this reason, they would travel like this. Syria was very puzzled. She asked the Duke to let her go so that she could sit on the other side. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that she was now without shoes. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why everything happened like this. He looked at her intently and, as if nothing had happened, said that he simply did not have time to intercept her slippers. He knew that there should be a pair of shoes in the luggage, but she could take her time with it and get some sleep. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if he could sleep in such conditions. The Duke sighed heavily as everything happened exactly as he expected. With the speed of lightning, he looked around the entire carriage and said that it seemed to be too cold. He took the young lady's legs in his hand. Syria was shocked and embarrassed by his action. She looked at him with confusion and said that he should not touch her feet. He looked at her with bewilderment, asked why he did not do something like that. The young lady, blushing, asked if he always touched other people's feet so calmly. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was not another person. Yet the young lady was embarrassed by his action. She looked away from him embarrassed and gathered her courage to ask him a question. Taking her eyes off him, she asked if he had taken her to the estate to spend their wedding night. The Duke froze in surprise as he had not expected such a question. A moment later he said with a grin that everything was exactly like that and it would take place there. The young lady looked closely at the Duke as if she understood that he was most likely lying. He asked in surprise how she had guessed. She smiled and said that it was all written on his face. She understood that in order for Togo to survive in such a world, she must understand the main character's train of thought. He sighed heavily and said that he was holding her feet in his hand, only because it was cold here, because there was no other way to warm them in the carriage, and he simply had no choice. The young lady looked at him intently and asked permission as a duchess to refuse his kindness. A moment later, she was taken aback and said that she was going to quit like Stara. Rush looked at her with a satisfied smile and asked why she corrected herself. She really was his duchess. He looked at her intently and said that if she was against it, then he was not able to contradict her. A few seconds later, their carriage began to shake violently. Herzen was shocked and asked the knights what had just happened. A moment later, he was told that their crew was being attacked by monsters. The Duke looked at the knight closely and asked how much further they were from the gates of the estate. The knight said that they were right ahead. The Duke looked at the knight closely and hurriedly said that everyone should put on astral armor. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and with a gentle smile said that they were very lucky to have her with them, and he also asked her to remain in the carriage, and he would send Lena to her at once. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke excited. A moment later, she reached out to him and grabbed his cloak. The Duke froze in surprise. She looked at him intently, not wanting to let go. A moment later, her lady told the Duke that he must take care of himself. The Duke froze for a moment in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing, but a moment later he nevertheless removed her hand from his cloak and said that he would take care of himself. Syria looked out the window intently. She was very worried. The young lady sighed heavily as she saw that the weather today was simply terrible. At the same time, the knights were engaged in a fierce battle with the monsters. The knight captain shouted to his subordinates to protect the carriage. Syria, in turn, was very excited. She wondered why the monsters were appearing. Syria wondered if it was because she had not approached the glacier. She was worried because she knew that only a few days had passed. A moment later, a young man entered the carriage and called out to the young lady. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was very warm in their carriage, and it seemed to him that it was just paradise there. She was surprised, looked at her, asked if he was really riding a horse. Lena sighed heavily and said that it was not so because he was sitting next to the luggage. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he hadn't gone with them. Lena paused for a moment for the meat, but still said that they were in a hurry and he needed to check something. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she knew that they would soon arrive at their destination. He said that once they entered the gate, she should not speak respectfully to anyone or about anyone except the Duke. Lena shouted that if she failed, they would all die because there were demons everywhere. A moment later, the young man screamed as there was a pitch-black demon outside the carriage window. The young lady was shocked and shouted at him that they needed to get out of the carriage as quickly as possible. A moment later, the demon grabbed the carriage with a death grip and began to shake it. A few seconds later, the Dukes were shouted that the carriage had been attacked. The Duke was taken aback because he knew who was in the carriage. The young lady slowly opened her eyes and sighed heavily. A moment later, she looked closely at the young man, for she saw that he lay unconscious beside her. Lena slowly stood up and asked the young lady if she was hurt. He sighed heavily and said that they miraculously managed to escape trouble. The young lady froze in shock when she saw the wound on his face. He looked at her closely and said that he felt a little dizzy and it was probably due to shock. She froze in surprise because she saw that demonic energy was entering him. Syria, in turn, did not lose her head, and with lightning speed embraced the young man, enveloping him in her power. Lena was shocked by the behavior of the young lady. Syria shouted at him to sit quietly because it would be bad if he was poisoned by demonic energy. The young man was taken aback when he heard her words. Syria in turn understood perfectly well that she did not have a strong ability to accelerate, but she knew that she had to cope with something like this. Lena shouted at the young lady to be careful as a monster was rushing towards them. The young lady in turn froze in shock. She didn't know what to do. A few seconds later, she saw the Duke, who dealt with the monster with lightning speed. She looked intently at the Duke as she hugged the young man. The Duke sighed heavily and asked them if they were wounded. Syria shouted that she was fine and not hurt at all. The Duke asked the young lady if the young man was dead. Lena, breathing heavily, said that he was still alive. The Duke looked at the young lady with anger and asked if his assistant was not killed. So why was he in her arms now? The young lady was taken aback and said that she was simply trying to cleanse him of demonic energy. After a few seconds, the young lady said that she had done everything, and now he had no demonic energy in his body. Syria looked at him intently, pushing him away from her. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed that everything was fine with him. The young man thanked the lady for saving him. But in turn, he understood perfectly well that judging by the Duke's look, everything would not be fine with him. The Knight Captain looked at the Duke intently and said that they had dealt with the monsters in the area, but the carriage had been broken after the attack. A few seconds later, the Duke informed his wife that they would continue on horseback. She smiled and said it was okay because she was very good in the saddle. He looked at her intently and asked what it meant. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. Sometime later, the young lady sighed heavily and asked the Duke if she was some kind of luggage. The Duke told her coldly that if it were so, she would ride behind him. She sighed heavily and said that she felt like a silkworm cocoon. He said that such insects did not live in his house, and it turns out that she had done him a huge disservice. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she was cold as ice and should sit still or she would freeze to death. She was shocked and wondered if he had to express his concern in such words. A moment later, she shyly snuggled closer to him, feeling his warmth. Sometime later, the Duke informed the young lady that they were almost there and she froze at the gates of the estate. A few seconds later, the Duke carried the young lady into the castle in his arms. She froze in shock when she saw the estate. The young lady could sense from the outside that something unpleasant was lurking there. The Duke looked closely at the young lady, for he saw that she was troubled by something. He looked at her carefully and asked if something had happened. Saria was taken aback and said that everything was fine, nothing had happened. But a moment later, she said that this place was different from his estate. A moment later, Madame came down to them and looked at the Duke in surprise. She looked at them in surprise and asked if he had come to them with his mistress. Saria said with a smile that he had come with a temporary wife. Madame was furious. She asked if marriage was something like a trial meal for them. She asked furiously about the Duke, if he had kidnapped the young lady. Saria said with a smile that it was not like that. The madam approached the young lady with lightning speed and froze in shock because her hands were simply icy. She was puzzled because she didn't know how they even got to their estate. Saria looked closely at Madame because she saw that her hands were very warm. Lennon, looking at the gentleman, said that the knights were already waiting for him at the gate. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he understood and would now come out to talk to them. The Duke looked closely at Martha and asked her to take his wife. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had her own legs and could move freely. Martha looked at the young lady intently and said that their floor was too dirty. Saria was shocked as she didn't understand how she could ask a grown woman to carry her in her arms, but Martha, with lightning speed, took the young lady in her arms and looked at her with a soft smile. The young lady looked at Martha with a puzzled expression and said that she was quite a strong woman. Martha smiled and thanked the young lady for such a flattering compliment and also told her to address her by her first name. The Duke left with the speed of lightning. The young lady in turn shouted to the Duke to take care of himself, but he did not hear her words. Martha sighed heavily and said that the Duke was stingy with emotions. Saria looked at Martha intently and said that she did not need to address her in a respectful manner. The lady of the evening noted that Martha did not speak to Mr. Lennon in that manner. Saria looked at them in surprise and asked what had happened because she saw that the atmosphere between them had changed. Martha looked at the young man with a smile and said that she was waiting for his satisfactory explanation. Martha looked at the young lady intently, and as she left, said that they needed to take her to a warm bath. Martha looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that she was cold as ice. Saria in turn sighed heavily but still agreed. Some time later, the young lady was placed in a warm bath. Martha was puzzled because she knew what they had to go through. The young lady in turn sighed heavily because she was glad that at least the bathroom was clean. Martha looked at the young lady closely and said that she initially thought that the Duke had kidnapped her and decided to hide her here. Saria said in surprise that the Duke was not that kind of person. Martha looked at the young lady with a tender smile and said that the Duke was much more emotional than it might have seemed to her at first glance. The young lady turned around for a moment and looked around as she noticed that the bathroom looked simple compared to what she had seen. Martha looked at the young lady and said that usually the servants use the bathroom since the others were in an unacceptable state right now. Saria wondered if Martha was reading her mind. She looked at Martha in surprise and asked if there really were other people at the estate. Martha sighed heavily and said that that was exactly how it was. There was also a gardener and a butler. Saria is surprised to hear this, as she thought that no one was looking after the estate because it was empty. Martha looked closely at the young lady and with a soft smile asked if she was warm enough. Syria in turn understood perfectly well that for some reason the Duke had abandoned this place, but she did not understand what exactly had happened. Lennon looked at the man closely and said that the estate was the same as it had been before. The man sighed heavily and with a gentle smile said that everything was exactly like that, and since that day it had remained unchanged. Lennon looked at him closely and asked if he was comfortable living there since everyone was talking about how the butler of the house never showed up at the main estate. Bastian said with a smile that there was nothing new here for him, and he had lived here for a very long time, and guests rarely came to the main estate. Bastian looked at the young man closely and said with a smile that he should tell him everything that had happened, and he also asked if their new duchess was the lady he had called cruel and ignorant the year before last. Lennon looked at the butler intently and asked him not to talk about what he had called her before because they were both now in excellent standing, and nothing should change that the man was surprised, but still promised him. Bastian looked at the young man in surprise and asked what had happened to her that he had completely changed his mind about the young lady. A moment later, a young lady entered their room and asked with a smile who had changed what the men tensed up as they did not expect to see her so soon. Lennon walked up to the young lady with a happy smile and said that they were just discussing how much the estate had changed with the speed of lightning. He sat her down at the table. He said that she must have been very hungry on the way, and now they would quickly serve her everything. Bastian looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it was an honor to meet her. He smiled and introduced himself and said that he was the butler of the house, and he would be very happy if she called him by his name. Syria looked at the butler intently. She had indeed never seen the butler of the main estate. She said with a smile that she was very glad to meet him. He looked at her closely and bowed with a smile, and also said that the others were busy with things at the moment, but he still asked her for forgiveness and said that they would greet her later. The young lady was taken aback and said with a smile that there was nothing to apologize for. He looked at her intently and said that he would bring her food right away while she could chat with the young master. The young lady in turn was puzzled because she saw that there was a lot of mold and it was moving. She wondered if it was solidified demonic energy. A moment later she was puzzled, looked at the wall because her guess was correct, and it was a demonic shadow. Demonic shadows is what the saint called the clots of demonic energy that hardened, becoming byproducts of the curse. They played a significant role in the events of the second part of the story. The saint gained influence over the imperial family when she was able to clear the bizarre demonic shadows that were bothering not only others, but even the high priest. The young lady knew that the saint had cleared the ones in the imperial palace. She wondered if that meant that she would need her help to get rid of them. The young man looked at her closely and asked if she had heard about it from the Duke by any chance. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that he was talking about mold. Lennon sighed heavily and said that it might cause her discomfort. He looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke had tried everything, but in the end he had called them to the estate. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Lennon looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke had tried everything, but eventually called him to the estate of the mages, and from the kingdom of Nesla. He said that as she could already see, the estate was teeming with black mold. This had been going on for 15 years. Lennon sighed heavily and said that they had tried every method known on the continent, but all was in vain. The young lady knew that the High Church condemned them and called them heretics. She asked the young man if it was worth telling him about it. Syria said that she was Sterna. After all, the young man sighed heavily and said that the Duke would generously reward her for her silence. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it wouldn't have been easier to just not bring her here. Lennon looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke was very eager to introduce her to Madame Martha. Syria froze in embarrassment. Lennon said that Madame had raised him since childhood. The young lady, embarrassed, looked away from him and said that they could come after the magic had performed its ritual here. Lennon looked at the young lady intently and said that that this was the last attempt. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She looked at him with alarm and asked what he was talking about and what he meant. The knight looked closely at the Duke and called him. The Duke turned around in a hurry and asked him what was wrong with the monsters. The knight said that they had dealt with them all. The young man sighed heavily and timidly started a conversation with the Duke about magicians. The Duke looked at him sideways and said that most likely the snowfall had delayed the magicians and they would probably arrive tomorrow. The Duke told the knight that he should not worry because they had to take the knights and return to the main estate. The Duke looked into the distance and said that this time they would definitely save her. Martha sighed heavily and told the young lady that her room was not yet completely ready, and if they had known in advance that she was coming, they would have prepared everything. The young lady smiled and told Martha that this room was quite good. Martha looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that since she lived here she did not need to address others with such honors. The young lady was taken aback, but still agreed. Martha said with a smile that she was a very charming girl. Martha sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry that it was only for a couple of days, but it was a great honor and joy for her to serve such a duchess. The young lady froze in place from embarrassment. She did not know what to answer, but a moment later she was dumbfounded because she did not understand why Martha said about a few days. Lennon looked at the young lady intently and said that the mold was eating away at the estate, and it seemed that it could not hold out any longer. She was surprised and excited, looked at him and asked why they didn't evacuate the servants. He sighed heavily and said that soon she herself would find out about the Russified. Syria was confused because she knew none of this was mentioned in the novel, so she didn't understand what was going on. As Martha was leaving, she said that the Duke was late and that she had better go to bed early. The young lady sighed heavily and agreed with her. She looked at Madame intently and asked where the Duke would sleep. Martha looked at her in surprise and said that of course he would sleep here. The young lady froze in shock. She asked Martha what she was talking about. Martha smiled and said that this room belonged to the Duke. Syria froze in shock. A moment later, she looked puzzled, looked at Madame and asked what she was talking about. Madame, with a happy smile, said that she forgot to tell her about it. Martha looked at the Duke intently and greeted him with smiles. He looked at her intently, asked about the young lady. Madame smiled and said that the lady had fallen asleep because she was very tired. Martha looked at the Duke intently and asked if the lady was really the same Syria Stern. The butler said that it was like a different person because a couple of years ago Lennon described her to him completely differently. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was her. Bastian was surprised he didn't understand why she had changed so much and wondered if something had happened. A moment later, the Duke stopped and said angrily that nothing special had happened. The Duke said angrily that she had become like that when she fell in love with a scoundrel. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to leave. The Duke walked slowly into his room and froze in place. He looked in surprise and intently at the young lady who was sleeping in the chair. The Duke was shocked because Madame did not say that the young lady was sleeping in his chambers. He looked at her in surprise because he didn't understand why she was lying in the chair. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she was quite compact, and he also slowly picked her up in his arms. A few seconds later, he carried her to bed. The Duke sighed heavily, for he knew that it would be better for her to fall asleep immediately on the bed. Before he could even sit down in the chair, he wondered if she would freeze. A moment later, he lit the fire. The Duke sighed heavily and sat down in a chair, for he knew that she had fallen asleep without putting out the fire, but he still thought that she was giving him a lot of trouble. A moment later, the Duke heard the young lady muttering something in her sleep. He wondered if she was still not warm. He noticed that the room was chilly. He realized that it would be very terrible if the precious Sterna died in her sleep, so he slowly approached her and wrapped her in a blanket. But a moment later, the Duke froze in place when he saw the sleeping nth lady. He remembered how she embarrassedly asked him if he had really taken her to the estate to spend their wedding night. He sighed heavily and wondered what he was thinking just now. He turned around and wanted to leave. A moment later, he froze in embarrassment as the young lady put her arms around his waist. He looked at her in surprise and called out, but she was fast asleep and did not answer him. The next morning, the young lady was fast asleep next to the Duke. She hugged his chest tenderly because it was warm and firm, but a moment later she realized what she was touching and was taken aback. She opened her eyes and froze in shock when she saw the Duke in front of her. She was confused and didn't understand what had happened at all and why he was next to her. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why he was hugging her in his sleep. Syria decided to leave the magician's bed with lightning speed. The Duke was sleeping. She quietly moved away from him and tenderly wrapped him in a blanket. She looked at the Duke with a sigh. She looked at him intently as she noticed that he was incredibly attractive. She was puzzled and did not understand how a person could have such perfect facial features. She thought that the main male characters were in a separate league. She understood perfectly well that it would be good if his gaze became kinder. The young lady slowly approached him, but after a few seconds the Duke opened his eyes and she froze in place in embarrassment. The young lady was taken aback, and with lightning speed moved away from him, while the Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady. Syria greeted him shyly. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really admired him enough and was now leaving. Syria, puzzled, said that nothing of the sort happened since she had simply covered him with a blanket. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if Madame had carried her to the bed, stretching. The Duke said that it was not so and that he had done it. She looked at her in surprise, asked why he did it. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if he really had to leave his wife sleep in a chair and take up the whole bed alone. He looked at her in surprise, asked why she had decided to sleep there. Bent over the young lady, timidly looked away from him and hesitating said that she felt most comfortable that way. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she was just afraid that he might do something to her. The young lady cried out in embarrassment that it was not true. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was true. He said that she had already been acting strangely because she had clung to him for warmth. The young lady was dumbfounded at his words. She cried out for him not to make things up, but he said that it was a fact. Madame Martha looked at the young people and said with a smile that they should call her when they finished breakfast. Syria looked at the Duke intently and said that she knew that the mages would come. She asked if she should stay in her chambers for now. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she should do that. After all, they were the ones who should avoid them. The young lady sighed heavily and said, while eating breakfast, that she would never report him to the high church as she owed her life to him. The Duke looked at her closely and said with a smile that it was very kind of her, but still the young lady said that she was interested in something. The Duke said she could ask him questions. Syria sighed heavily and said that she wanted to talk about the estate. Since the conditions here were not what you would call ordinary, she looked at him intently and asked why he insisted that Martha and Bastian stay here. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had never done anything like that. She looked at him in surprise, expressing strength. Why didn't they leave the estate then if he didn't order them to stay? The Duke said that they were bound to the estate and could not move a step from here. The young lady froze in surprise. She wondered if they were cursed. The Duke sighed heavily and said that, to be more precise, only Martha could not leave. The others claimed that they liked it here and did not want to leave. He knew perfectly well that this was a complete lie on their part. The young lady froze for a moment as she realized that the madam was connected to the estate, which could no longer contain the demonic shadows on the disc. Syria knew perfectly well that when the building collapsed, Martha would die. She looked closely at the Duke and asked if he had really turned to the magicians to rescue her. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was true. He said that it was not the first time and he had tried before. Rausch was puzzled because he knew that everything happened because of him. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. She did not understand what his words meant. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if the Duke had really gone to check the borders. Despite the snowdrifts being as high as he was, Lena sighed heavily and said that it was reasonable of him since they had encountered monsters. The young lady was worried because she thought that something could have happened to the Duke in this weather. Lena looked at her in surprise and asked if she was talking about the gentleman. The young lady was taken aback and asked if such a thing was impossible. Lena, leaving, told the young lady that she still knew the Duke too little. He is an unusual man who will get out of the heart of the desert alive. She remembered when he said that everything happened because of him. She then noticed that the Duke's face reflected pain. She knew that he had done nothing to suffer, but she understood that Madame was a close person to him, and therefore he was worried about her. The young lady looked closely at the Duke's assistant and asked if he could tell her exactly what had happened here at the estate. He sighed heavily, but still agreed to tell her. Lena looked at the young lady closely and said that she should know about it all after all. Since she was now a member of the house, he said that the story was long, but he would make it short. It all happened when the young master was 15 years old. His father, the previous duke, brought his illegitimate son to this estate. Both wanted to overthrow the master from his place as heir. The duke always found something to reproach him for. Moreover, he threatened Sir Eliot, who was the lord's only knight at the time, with the chest of the Emerald Sea. This chest is a relic of the House of Burke, used by experienced glory-seeking knights to purely become protectors of the Laurel estate. Those who put a lock of their hair in it will no longer be able to leave the estate. The Duke continued to press the young man to explain why he refused to do so, since he truly wanted to become a knight of the house, and eventually, Madame Martha put a lock of her hair there. She did not want the only knight of the Lord to belong to this place forever. From that very time she could not leave the estate, and those who were close to her decided to stay with her. Lennon sighed heavily and said there were many more details to the story, but he wanted to keep it short. The young lady was puzzled, for she knew that none of this was in the book, but she did not understand why the Duke's father had done such a thing. Lennon looked at the young lady with a keen and worried expression, and asked her not to be too upset with the gentleman for bringing her to such a terrible place. Lennon said that as far as he knew, the gentleman only wanted to introduce her madam. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was not at all offended by the Duke. Syria looked at the young man with a radiant smile and said that she, on the contrary, was grateful that he shared such personal information with a stranger. Lennon looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and said that she was not a stranger at all, because she was now a member of the house, and as soon as the imperial family approved their union, she would become the closest person to the master. He smiled and said that he was looking forward to the day when he could officially call her a duchess. The young lady in turn looked intently at the estate, for she knew that there had to be a way to save the estate and the people who called it home. The young lady stared at the wall as she knew that she could still cleanse the manor. But she was puzzled because she understood that at such a speed it would take a long time. She understood that the power of purification was too weak. Syria knew that in the novel, the saint discovered the source of the demonic energy and purified it using her saint power. She knew that there was a source here somewhere in the estate. The butler looked intently at the young lady and called her with a smile. A moment later, he asked her permission with a smile to introduce Suzette to her. Suzette looked at the young lady intently and said that she was a seamstress and also the gardener of the estate. She smiled and asked the lady to accept her belated greeting. The young lady looked at her with a smile and said that she was glad to meet her and introduced herself. The butler looked closely at the radio and said with a smile that she should go into the dining room as they had prepared dishes that might suit her taste. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. After a while, the young lady looked at all the dishes with confusion and asked what was going on. The madam looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and said that no one else in their estate ate such food. She looked closely at the young lady and said that they were a little puzzled when the gentleman suddenly brought so many desserts. Martha smiled and told the young lady that it was all for her. Syria asked in surprise if it was all for her. She looked at everyone present and said that it was not that she did not like them, but she was not able to eat everything. Everyone present was puzzled. Some time ago, Martha asked the gentleman if the lady liked sweets. The Duke said that she liked them quite well. Martha looked at the young lady with excitement and told her everything that the Duke had told her. The young lady was puzzled because she did not understand why he suddenly thought so. One remembered how the Duke said that only Martha could not leave the estate, while the rest claimed that they liked being in the estate. The young lady looked at the butler intently and asked what his reason was when he told the Duke that he wanted to live in the estate. Everyone froze for a moment because they did not expect such a question. The butler froze for a moment. He hesitated and said that your estate is a kind of boulder. It consists of a special kind of sugar. The butler told the Duke that having tasted that sugar, he no longer enjoyed any tastes. Bastian sighed heavily and said that of course the Duke did not believe him. The lady looked at them intently but said nothing. A moment later, she told the butler that perhaps the Duke was trying to show him what sweets there were outside the estate, hinting that it was time for him to move on. She said that the Duke knew perfectly well that he had given such a reason only to reassure him. The butler trembled with tears in his eyes because he did not suspect what meaning the Duke put into this madam. With tears in her eyes, said that the gentleman was still the same little boy as they remembered him, and he was very kind. The young lady looked at them intently, as she understood that the Duke cared very much for them. She knew perfectly well that it had nothing to do with her, but for some reason her heart ached. The young lady was puzzled, but knew perfectly well that it was time for her to admit it to herself. Syria looked at the estate intently as she realized that she had already become attached to this place. Finding herself in the body of a young lady, she suffered every day just to survive. But she understood perfectly well that she had not been able to rest for a long time as she did now. She fell in love with this simple, spacious, and serene estate. She knew perfectly well that this was the place where the Duke grew up, and this place was never mentioned in detail in the novel. She realized that it did not say at all what happened in the estate, and the saint never came to this place because it disappeared before it had time to appear. She knew perfectly well that she had every reason to consider it her personal one, but at least she could be sure that the estate would never leave her for the saint as the Marquis had done. She understood that she first needed to find the source of the demonic energy because she hoped that there was some way to settle everything. A few hours later, the young lady found a passage to the basement. She felt some energy and realized that there was something there. She understood that a stronger demonic energy was coming from there. She thought for a moment as she remembered that Madame had told her that the mages had arrived at the estate and gone to the basement, and they would try very hard to avoid being seen by them. The young lady in turn wondered whether she should go or whether now was not the best time. A moment later, a young man quietly crept up to her and asked her in a puzzled tone why she was there. Syria was shocked and very scared. She flinched and screamed in surprise. Turning around, she looked at the young man puzzled and said that he had scared her very much. He looked at her with a smile and asked if it was true and also apologized for his actions. But a moment later, the young lady froze in shock as she saw the young man fall to the ground with a loud thud. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise and also wondered what had happened to him. She looked at Suzette in surprise as she hit the young man and he fell to the ground with a thud. Syria looked at her in surprise and called out, but Suzette didn't even flinch. Syria looked at Suzette with a puzzled expression and asked if she had knocked the young man unconscious with one blow. Suzette said that was exactly it, and she had done it because he had dared to sneak up on the young lady. Suzette looked at the young lady sharply and said that she didn't need to address her so formally. Syria looked at her sharply as she was intimidated by her. Syria said with a smile that she was fine, and that was true. Suzette shouted with fury that she had been trying to correct the young man's bad habits for a long time. She asked the lady's forgiveness for this one-time oversight. Suzette drew her sword from its sheath and walked towards the young man. The young lady looked at her intently as she reminded her of her protector, Abi. Syria looked closely at the girl and realized that she was much more cruel. Syria realized that all the servants in the Burke household were very formidable. Suzette looked closely at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to look in the basement. Syria looked at her with admiration and asked if she could do it. Suzette said that there was no place in the estate where she would not be allowed. Suzette looked at the young lady intently and said that the master had given his permission for this. Suzette told the young lady that for that reason she could go with her if she wished, and the young lady in turn was very glad of the news. A moment later, they finally went down to the basement. The young lady was puzzled because she felt that someone had burned some herbs. She walked in slowly and, opening the door, noticed that there were magicians there. She was puzzled because she saw and smelled the insania herb, which was basically a weed, but it had divine power and acted as a sleeping pill. Syria knew that she shouldn't dwell on such things because the Duke was the owner of this estate and the head of a great house. He was famous for his divine power, but she was puzzled and didn't understand how they dared to do this. Syria looked at the mages and called out to them. They turned around and looked at her with cold fury. She looked at them intently and said that the Duke was now in the estate, and they should know that they could not burn grass in his presence. The magician looked at the young lady intently, with anger, but did not answer. He slowly walked up to the young lady and casually said that as far as they knew, the Duke would be away from the estate for a while, so there was no problem. He looked at her with fury and said that this was an important part of their attempts to dispel the sinister darkness. The lady looked at them intently and wondered if the emerald sea chest was really near them now. The man looked at the young lady with fury and asked who she was. She did not answer, and he said with equal fury that he had asked her a question. Syria looked at them and shouted angrily for them to calm down. She looked at them with cold fury and said that they knew perfectly well who she really was. She was furious and did not understand where such impudence came from to demand an answer from her. The men looked at each other, not knowing what to answer. The young lady in turn was trembling with fear as her heart almost jumped out of her chest, but in turn she imitated the real Ceres. The man looked at the young lady with fury and asked where she thought she was now. But a moment later the man was taken aback as a sword appeared near his throat. Suzette looked at the magician with fury and asked if he had gone mad. She screamed that he should not block the path of her mistress. The man shouted with cold fury at the girl to lower her sword. Suzette in turn did not even flinch and shouted at the magician to shut his mouth. The young lady sighed heavily and approached the box. She was puzzled because she knew that her powers were not strong enough because she was not a saint. The man was furious and shouted that they kept interfering with their spells. The young lady looked sideways at her protector and said that they had no business here and therefore they should leave. The young lady leaving was burning with rage because she understood that the chest of the Emerald Sea was the cause of everything. She was confident in her judgments, but still she was furious because she did not know what to do. The young lady slowly handed the Duke a few twigs. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he needed them. She smiled and said that she wanted her to be with him because he went every day to check if there were any monsters somewhere. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that there was no need for war because his wife was always by his side. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she couldn't hug him and clean him like she had done with his assistant earlier. He sighed heavily and said that it sounded very strange. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she shouldn't be more comfortable hugging him since they were married. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he would really ask her to hug him. She smiled and said that of course she could do it, but not in his chambers. But for example in the hall, the young lady embarrassedly looked away from him and asked if they would really go there. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she was sometimes surprisingly naive. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and confusion because she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later she said that she had gone down to the basement today. The Duke looked at her closely and asked how the magicians were. Syria said that they had behaved impudently, but Suzette had reined them in. I asked in surprise if she was needed. She couldn't deal with them alone. The Duke looked at the table in surprise and asked what it was all about. The young lady smiled and said that Suzette had tied the flowers for her, and Martha had brought the milk. The young lady froze for a moment, as she had just realized that she didn't remember them in history. She wondered if this meant that all the servants had disappeared along with the manor. She knew perfectly well that, just like the real Ceres, she couldn't expect eternal kindness and good manners from her either, but she knew one thing for sure because she didn't want everyone in the estate to die. She looked at the Duke intently and wondered if it was a terrible thing to remain silent when she knew the solution to the problem. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she had been looking around the estate for some time and thought she had found a way to clean it. The Duke froze in shock as he had not expected to hear such a thing. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really found a way. She sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. She said she was convinced that the saint had the power to help with this. The young lady in turn wondered if she would be the one to bring the Duke and the saint together. Syria knew perfectly well that their marriage was temporary, but first the Marquise and now the Duke, and because of this she felt uneasy. She knew perfectly well that they were both the main characters. She understood perfectly well that no matter what it would turn out to be for her, but they were destined to be together. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that they should close this topic. She was surprised, looked at her, asked what he was talking about. He said that she should not mention the saint anymore. He looked at her intently and asked if there were any other ways. He wanted to know if she could manage on her own. The young lady was taken aback and shouted that she was afraid she couldn't do it. She asked if he didn't believe her. Syria said she was convinced the saint would be able to get rid of the shadows. The Duke in turn said he had no desire to allow a woman who was not connected to his family to come to this house. And besides, she would not appear at the first call. Syria looked at the Duke intently and said that if he wanted he could temporarily hire the saint as her escort. She said that she could not do it herself, since she already had an escort knight. The Duke said angrily that it seemed he should express himself more clearly. Rush looked at the young lady intently and said that he did not wish to bring any women to this estate except his duchess. The lady was puzzled. She did not understand why he refused to do this. She understood perfectly well that the saint was the only one who could save the estate. The young lady looked timidly at the Duke. A moment later, she said she just didn't want anyone to die here. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if that was really why she suggested calling the saint. He sighed heavily and asked if she had no pride at all, and his young lady was momentarily taken aback and stood frozen in place. He looked at her intently and said that she could worry about these people, but first and foremost, she needed to think about herself. He looked at her closely and asked if she was afraid that he might follow in the footsteps of the Marquis. The young lady was shocked by his words, and she did not understand why he asked her about it. She wondered how she could not be afraid. She saw that the estate was beautiful, perfect, and peaceful, and the people there were kind and willing to share their kindness with her. She understood that if the saint were here, she could become the center of this world. Syria knew perfectly well that she would be lying if she said she was not afraid, and the very thought of it made her envious. She was puzzled because she was afraid that the Duke might choose the saint, but in turn she understood perfectly well that all the people living in the estate could die in an instant. She wondered how she could pretend to be ignorant when she knew the way to save them. She was furious because she simply wanted to help them, and she understood that she had done nothing to deserve such harsh words. A moment later, the lady rose up with the speed of lightning and, looking at the Duke, said that he was not like the Marquis. She looked at him intently and said that she had chosen him, but she had not chosen the Duke and the estate. The Duke looked at the young lady with cold fury and said that she had taken and he was not the man she had chosen. She looked at him sharply and said that since they had agreed on it, she would like him to refrain from showing her any special attention. He looked at her sharply and said that it seemed she had misunderstood his words regarding his duchess. As she left, the young lady sighed heavily and said that she had been mistaken, which was very impudent on her part. She turned around and said that she didn't care at all whether he called the saint, so he should think carefully about all the words that had been said earlier. The Duke sighed heavily and looked intently after the young lady. He was puzzled by everything that was happening and did not know what to do. The young lady walked slowly down the corridor. She was puzzled because she understood that it had turned out very unpleasantly because they had managed to get along recently. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that Marta was connected to this place because of the Duke's illegitimate half-brother born from another woman. The young lady remembered the Duke's words. She understood perfectly well that the reason was very obvious, but she was furious when he asked her if she was afraid that he might just go for the Marquis, and the young lady was puzzled and did not understand how he could say something like that. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw Martha lying on the ground. The young lady was taken aback and called her, but unfortunately she heard no answer. With lightning speed, she ran to Martha as she wanted her to come to her senses immediately. Syria froze in shock when she saw blood on her hands. Trembling with fear, she turned around and called out to the Duke. But Syria froze in shock when she saw the knife at her throat. The magician looked at the young lady intently and said with fury that he had found the best sacrifice to offer to his god. Syria froze in surprise and shock. For some time, the young lady sat quietly on the ground without moving. The man looked at her with a smirk and said that she could come with them. But a moment later, he received a blow to the back that knocked him to the ground. Suzette looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. A moment later, the butler ran up to them and called Madame. The magician lay on the ground and was breathing heavily. He could not get up because he was pinned to the ground. Syria was taken aback for a moment and remembered their recent conversation, as she found it very strange that the mage was asking who she was, since she knew very well that she had an unusual hair color, and anyone who had heard what she looked like would immediately recognize her. Syria looked at him with rage and asked why he came here. Recently, a young lady asked Suzette if she had once been a knight. Syria glanced sideways at the maid and said that she found something suspicious about those people, so she asked her to keep an eye on them. Suzette in turn said that she would do everything. The young lady was very glad that she had asked her for help, but she could not even imagine such behavior. Syria looked at her closely and asked what happened to the other shamans. Suzette said that she left one tied up on one floor and went here to get the other two. But a moment later she was taken aback and turned around with the speed of lightning because she heard some noise. With lightning speed she pushed the young lady away, as well as she saw that the man was heading towards them with a blade in his hand, preparing to strike the young lady. But a moment later they froze in place as they saw a small dagger flying towards the magician. The Duke looked at the men with cold fury and said that they were just savages. He slowly walked closer to them and asked if the young lady was okay. Some time later, the young lady lay quietly in bed, puzzled by everything that was happening. Recently, the Duke told her that she should return to her room. She sighed heavily as she knew that after their quarrel, she was not comfortable being in his room. She was glad that they had managed to save her madam because she knew that the attacker had almost hit her vital organs. A moment later, she was taken aback as the Duke called her. But in turn, the young lady did not answer and continued to lie quietly in bed. The Duke looked at her intently but did not answer. She was furious and knew he might not even expect her to talk to him. She knew she didn't care, and he could settle into a chair or lie down on the floor. But the Duke acted differently. He quietly stroked her head, slowly, touched her hair, and a moment later took hold of the blanket. The young lady shuddered. A few seconds later, she jumped up and sat on the bed in embarrassment. She was confused because she didn't understand what he was doing. The Duke looked at her with alarm and said that he was only checking to see if she was hurt. She was confused, looked at the Duke and said that she was fine. He looked at her in surprise and said that she had previously reported the maid that she suspected the shamans. He said that she could have been seriously injured if the blade had hit its target. He asked if she understood how often to put herself in danger. The Duke did not understand how she could be so reckless. The young lady looked at him with fury and said that they would not dare to harm her, since they knew very well that she was Sterna. Sterna looked at him and said that nothing had happened that would bother him. He looked at her with cold fury and said that she knew perfectly well that this was not what he was worried about. He was furious and asked why she had not shared her doubts about them with him. The young lady asked in a dull voice whether he had really asked her such a thing. She asked angrily what she could say to someone who had decided to break up her marriage only to ridicule her choice later. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Syria looked at the Duke intently and said that he took every opportunity to hurt her. She said that she had upset him, so he tried to intimidate her into silence. The young lady was shocked because after all this, he expected her to discuss the issue of her safety with him. She looked at him intently and asked how this was possible. She wanted to know how he would have acted in her place. The Duke was stunned by her judgment. He reached out to her and said he never wanted this, but she turned away from him because she knew he was lying to her. A moment later, the Duke asked the young lady for forgiveness, and she froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he should not have thrown around his remarks so thoughtlessly, and he sincerely asked her forgiveness once again. The young lady stood frozen in shock as he apologized to her several times. The young lady looked timidly at the Duke and called out to him. A few seconds later, she accidentally staggered on the bed. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it didn't even tickle him, let alone hurt. He noticed that she didn't understand at all how to attack a knight. She was surprised, looked at him, and said that it was a pure accident. The young lady understood perfectly well that since he had apologized, she should not hold on to her pride either, and besides, she understood why he said such a thing. A moment later, the young lady pulled away from him and invited him into bed. He looked at her in surprise, asked if she really wanted him to lie down next to her. She looked away from him in embarrassment and asked if she had to ask him such an awkward question. The young lady sighed heavily and said sheepishly that he must be tired. Because of today's incident, she asked if he really wanted to spend the night sitting up. He said that he would not be surprised if she suggested it. She looked at him in surprise and asked who he thought she was. She wanted to know if he would wish the same for her. The Duke approached the young lady with lightning speed and said with a smile that he would not wish such a thing. Rush looked at her intently and said sheepishly that she should call him by his name. She was shocked because she didn't know how to behave in such a situation. She looked at him intently and timidly asked him to wait. But the Duke had no intention of doing this. He came closer to her and she quietly whispered his name. A moment later, Rush kissed her tenderly. The young lady pulled away from the passionate kiss when she heard some strange sound. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Saria, trembling with fear, asked the Duke if he had heard the sound. He looked at her closely and noticed that she was trembling with fear. He smiled and said that of course he heard everything and he was just joking. The young lady was shocked by his action. She looked at him intently and said with excitement that she almost went crazy. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he knew perfectly well that no one else had noticed him. The young lady was taken aback by his words because the sound was very loud. She wondered why only they heard it. She wondered if this sound was somehow special. She knew very well that the Gyrux Empire was founded by a great Saint Gremmel who was blessed by the heavens. He was given several divine gifts. The first was the great fortune which extended to his imperial family. The second was 17 houses each with their own personal divine power. Thanks to Gremmel, these houses continued to pass on holy magic to new generations. Now they are also known by the holy title of Grand Van Shet. Among them, the representative houses were the House of Hanet, the House of Keladine, and the House of Burke. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the sound was heard only by those who possessed divine power. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew if there was an altar in the basement. He looked at her in surprise and said that nothing like this could exist on these lands. Saria thought for a moment and said that she definitely felt some kind of weak power when she was there before, and it probably came from the old holy relic. She thought that the source of the shadows might be the same there. She thought for a moment, as she thought it sounded presumptuous. The Duke slowly came closer to her and said that she must listen to him carefully. He looked into her eyes and said that she must remain in the room where she would be safe, and he would immediately go and see where the sound came from. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he had previously asked her to stay in his room. She looked at him intently and said excitedly that it seemed he had accidentally forgotten who she was. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand since when this story turned into a horror story. She was legitimized and very scared because she did not understand who put out all the candles. The Duke looked at her closely and said that she was shaking badly and also asked if she was cold. Saria was puzzled and said that she was not, because she was just scared. Rush took her hand firmly and asked with a smile if she was afraid the young lady froze in place from embarrassment. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that this was some kind of paradox. He smiled a soft smile and said that before she behaved thoughtlessly, but now your darkness. The young lady in turn did not answer him and only walked with him arm in arm. She noticed that he had large and warm hands. A moment later, they entered the dungeon. The young lady paused for a moment in front of the large portrait. The Duke in turn slowly raised the lantern higher. Rush sighed and said that this was the former Duchess. He glanced sideways at the young lady and said that she was his mother. The young lady was surprised because she saw his mother again. She was very beautiful. She wondered if they had similar characters. She looked at the Duke in surprise as she noticed that he had moved away from her. She came closer to him and looked at the book with bewilderment, as she did not understand what was in front of her. The Duke said that these were historical records about his family. He said a couple of pages had been torn out, so he took them downstairs for safety. She was surprised because she could see the history of his family described. Saria knew that the book was mentioned a couple of times in the novel. She knew that he, the Duke, attached great importance to her. Saria remembered that the young man had said that the previous Duke and his illegitimate son had wanted to overthrow the Lord from his place as heir. She assumed that the Duke's father had torn out a couple of pages when he learned of his other son's existence. She looked closely at the Duke, for she knew that he was the head of a great house, but had only inherited a part of the family history that had been passed down through generations. She wondered if the Duke's father had tried to sabotage his rule. Saria was furious because she knew he was just a terrible person. She didn't understand how he could do that to his own son. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback because she sensed the energy. She slowly walked towards where the flow of energy was coming from. She froze in shock when she saw the constellation steel monolith. She was shocked that they left such a valuable thing in such a place. She didn't understand how many of them were there. But a moment later, another relic caught her attention. She heard someone's voice telling her to take it. The young lady was shocked. In turn, she slowly reached out to the relic as if enchanted. The Duke looked around in surprise because he did not see the young lady next to him. He looked into the distance in surprise and asked what she was doing. But a moment later, he noticed a bright light and ran towards the young lady, for he saw that she was gradually being enveloped in a glow. The young lady in turn slowly reached out to the relic it froze, and strength gradually flowed into it. Bitter memories suddenly came flooding back to her. She also saw a young man who presented her with flowers with a joyful smile. She saw a strange woman who was grieving and begged him not to reject her. The young lady woke up from a terrible nightmare and shuddered. She was puzzled because she did not understand where she did not understand. What happened? She recalled what happened in the estate, but then all her memories sank into oblivion. She was taken aback and froze in shock when she saw her protector who was hugging her tightly. Ebby said with fury that on the third day of her unconsciousness, she was close to destroying the entire estate with her bare hands. Syria in turn was shocked by this news. She looked at her protector in surprise and asked where she was now. She looked at the knight intently and said that since she was here, she was being returned to the main estate. Ebby looked at the young lady intently and said that everything was true, and they were now in the Duchess's chambers, because the Duke ordered the servants to bring her here. Syria looked at her in surprise and asked if this was true. A moment later, the young lady saw Suzette and Bastien. She was surprised, but at the same time incredibly happy. She looked at them in surprise and asked what they were doing here. A moment later, they were kneeling before the young lady. Bastien said with a smile, young lady, that she must accept their deepest gratitude, and from Madame Maranta as well. He looked at the young lady intently and said that they would never forget the price she had paid to save the estate. The young lady was taken aback by his words. She looked at him intently and told him to repeat it again. Immediately, she asked if he really meant to say that the shadows had disappeared. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was just like that, and they disappeared completely. Suzette looked at her intently and said that they would like to devote themselves entirely to serving her. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening. She wondered if the demonic shadows were really gone. She knew perfectly well that the saint had not even come close to that place. Martha was very happy. She was pleased to see that the shadows had really gone away. She remembered how her mistress, knowing her, wandered around the palace because she wanted to get rid of the demonic shadows. Martha could see that the young lady was upset that her powers were not enough. Martha thought of the young lady with a joyful smile, for she knew that the Duke had found himself an excellent wife and a duchess of the house. The young lady was puzzled because she lost consciousness when she touched the relic. She looked closely at the relic as she remembered it. In the book, this diadem ended up in the hands of Syria's older brother, Nisus Kelladena, after a fierce struggle between several minor male characters. Then the young man gave it to the saint, and from then on, she wore it every time she went out. Syria was surprised and puzzled because she did not understand how the tiara ended up in the estate, because she had previously thought that the young man bought it at some auction house. Suzette looked closely at the young lady and asked if something was bothering her. Syria looked at her intently and said that since her grandfather was found in the wrong place, she should be given to the Duke. She looked at the young lady and said what the gentleman had given her. Syria was taken aback because she did not expect to hear anything like that. She was shocked and did not understand why he gave her such a valuable thing. She understood perfectly well that this was a very important family heirloom. She knew that this tiara was intended for a saint. Suzette said with a smile that everything that the Burke house had was now hers. The young lady was shocked and at the same time confused because she did not understand what was going on at all. She remembered the moment when she suddenly touched the tiara in the basement. She remembered those terrible memories she had seen earlier. She remembered the young man who, with his joyful smile, presented a beautiful bouquet to the young lady. Syria was a little confused. She didn't understand what she saw the establishment. After all, she didn't remember anything like that happening in the book. She wondered if she had forgotten some parts of the plot. Sometime later, late in the evening, she was walking around the castle grounds. A moment later, she turned around as the Duke put his cape on her. He smiled and asked if she really wanted to freeze to death. She was surprised as she didn't expect to see him. He sighed heavily and looked at the young lady and said that he understood perfectly well that she wanted to see him, but she could inform his assistant about it. She smiled and said that she had nothing urgent. Rush looked at her closely and asked if she was feeling better yet. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that he had asked more quickly than usual. Syria said with a smile that she actually wanted to talk about something else. She smiled and thanked him for the wonderful gift and said that she had decided to wear it as a necklace, and she knew that putting such an antique piece on her head would be a little impractical. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that it didn't sound so terrible. She was surprised, looked at him and asked if he was serious. He smiled and said that of course he was, since he had no reason to lie to her. The young lady sheepishly said that he said so because he didn't have to wear it. He smiled and said that she was right. Syria looked at her husband closely and with a sly smile asked if he wanted to do it. He smiled and said that if she put it on him herself, he would do it. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really hoped that she would not dare to do it. A moment later, the young lady said that he should bow his head a little. He smiled a sly smile and said that he would do as she wished. A moment later, the young lady took off her necklace and reached for the Duke, but froze in embarrassment on the spot as he was very close to her. She froze with embarrassment along with her glory and pride. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and thanked her for saving the estate. The lady froze in embarrassment, unable to move. He looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that he was her eternal debtor. She was surprised and looked intently at the Duke as she did not expect to hear anything like that. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She could not take her eyes off him. A moment later, she said, embarrassed that the necklace did not suit him at all. She looked away from him and said that she would wear it herself. He smiled and said that she could do whatever she wanted. She asked if he knew that this pendant contained divine power. The Duke said that it looked like a relic, but hardly anything unusual. She said that it contained more divine power than an ordinary relic. He sighed heavily and said that this explained why she was so pleased. She looked at him in surprise and asked if there was anything else he wanted to say. She looked at him intently and asked indignantly if he understood how precious and powerful this thing was. She screamed that he should demand it back. He took the pendant from her with a smile and kissed it tenderly, saying that he didn't have a habit of taking gifts back, and besides it looked much better on her. The young lady in turn froze in place in embarrassment. A moment later, she rose with lightning speed and said, leaving, that she must resume checking the glacier. Next week, he looked after her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to monopolize all the affairs of his servants. The young lady in turn said sheepishly that it didn't sound so bad. She turned around and said with a radiant smile that she liked it better when people didn't despise her. She looked closely at the Duke and asked if he wasn't the same way. He looked at her intently and said that it was true. Syria looked at him in surprise and asked what he just said. The Duke looked at the young lady tenderly, for he knew that she had changed completely, and it was very strange. A moment later, he said that they could already return to the house. She looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he couldn't understand why she wanted to see the prisoner who was being tortured. She sighed heavily and said that she thought those shamans had come to the estate for a special purpose. The young lady walked slowly past the cameras. She froze for a moment in surprise. She looked closely at the men because she noticed that their condition was much better than she expected. Lennon looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the Burke's interrogation methods were not as ruthless as she might have thought. The young lady came closer to the man and called him. She looked at him with cold fury and carelessness and showed him the relic and asked if this was why he came to the estate. A moment later, the man pounced on the young lady with lightning speed when he saw the divine relic. The Duke managed to push the young lady away, shielding her with his body. The young lady was taken aback as she saw the magician spit out his teeth. Lennon looked at the man with a smile and said that he had told him to keep his mouth shut so they wouldn't spill. He walked up to the man and with lightning speed threw the teeth back into his mouth and also told the man to be obedient because he was scaring his mistress. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise because he had recently said that they did not use cruel methods against her. The Duke pulled her away from them and said that since she had found out what she wanted, they could leave. The Duke looked at the Knights Commander closely and asked if Mitchell was behind all of this. Elliot sighed and said that it was, and they assumed that his approach was much harsher than they thought. The young lady looked at them in confusion, as she did not understand who they were talking about. The Duke was very angry. He knew that Mitchell had been furious when he found out he was a bastard, and now he was completely mad. The Duke wondered with fury if he really thought that destroying the House of Burke would change the fact of his birth. The young lady looked intently at the Duke, for she now understood who he was talking about. From the words of the Duke's assistant, she knew that the young man was the favorite of the previous Duke, and since he hired armed shamans, it meant that he really had gone crazy. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he needed the holy relic. The Duke looked closely at the young lady, for he saw that she was troubled by something, and a moment later he said that he was not concealing any illegitimate children. She looked at him intently and said that she knew it. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. She smiled and said that he would not do such a thing. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was the first time she had praised him. The young lady smiled and said that if someone else heard this, he would think that she was only criticizing him. He sighed heavily and, looking at her, said that this was very close to the truth. The young lady sighed heavily but did not answer. The Duke looked at the young people in surprise and asked what had happened between them because they both seemed very strange to him. The young lady in turn stood there embarrassed, not knowing what to answer, and the commander of the knights also sat down at the table. She was puzzled because she tried very hard to hide it and did not understand how the Duke understood that something had happened between them. In the morning of the same day after waking up, the young man came to her. Then he said that his life and honor belonged to the Laurel estate. Bursting into tears, he said that this meant that now they were hers too. She was surprised and puzzled by such behavior of the young man. She was not surprised that what had happened had awakened deep feelings in him, since he should have been in Martha's place. But still his tears were a surprise to her. The Duke looked at them with cold fury and asked what had happened. But a moment later they were interrupted. Lennon, in turn, with his lightning speed, burst into their room and called the Duke. Lennon looked at everyone present and said that a group of priests, including the high priest, went to the high church, but they were caught in a snowstorm and monsters. He looked closely at the Duke and said excitedly that the Saint and the Marquis were there too. Lennon that they had received urgent messages that the lady and a detachment of knights must set out immediately. The young lady in turn was stunned by this news. The Duke sighed heavily and asked how serious the danger was. The young man sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they were not told anything about it. The Duke looked at his assistant intently and told him to tell them to all die of cold together. The young man was shocked by his words. As he left, the Duke said that if they really needed help, they could send knights led by Elliot to them. The young man was puzzled and shouted to the Duke that the high priest himself had asked them for help. The young lady understood perfectly well that most likely the Duke refused because he did not want to put her in a difficult position. But she knew very well that refusing the high priest's request would definitely have a negative impact on the Duke's house. She was puzzled because she had sworn to do everything possible for him, and she understood that she could not allow the high church to begin to feud with them. A moment later her Naledi called out to the Duke and he stopped. She looked at him intently and said that she thought it would be better to help them. Lennon looked at the lady intently, as he was glad that she had nevertheless decided to set the Duke on the right path. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she was sure they should do this. She said that the high priest himself was calling her. He said that he could think of several excuses. The young people looked at the couple in bewilderment. The Duke looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that she did not have to go at all. She looked at him embarrassedly as she understood that he was protecting her. He looked at her intently and, kneeling down, said that if the request did not embarrass her, then they could go to them together. She looked at him shyly as she was glad for his support. She took his hand with a smile and said it to him. The young people in turn were puzzled by such behavior of the spouses because they did not expect to see something like this. Sometime later, the Duke and his wife arrived at the scene. The high priest looked at the young lady with a deep gaze and thanked her with a smile for answering the request for help. The young lady looked at High Priest Amos with a deep gaze. He looked at her with a smile and greeted her, and she greeted him too. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had matured a lot, and he would like to admit that this was a big surprise for him. The young lady was shocked by his behavior because she knew what he was like from the book. Syria was shocked that such a stern man complimented her. In turn, the Duke hid the young lady with lightning speed. He looked closely at the priest and asked how big a threat the monsters had created. The priest said with a smile that they could walk you, and he would tell you everything. The high priest looked at the young lady intently and said that if she didn't mind, she might as well go in peace since the priests would soon bring them a map. The young lady was taken aback and agreed. The Duke turned around with lightning speed and looking intently at his wife asked if she would mind being alone for a while. The young lady froze in place for a moment. All the knights were also shocked by the Duke's behavior. A moment later, the young lady was overcome with embarrassment. She looked at him intently and shouted that he didn't need to treat her like a little girl because she was sterna. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was a very dangerous place. She was angry and called him by name. He looked at her with a smile and said that they could see each other later, and he also called her his precious mistress with a smile. Syria was very confused by the Duke's behavior because she did not expect anything like this, but in the end she still came to the tent. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that the Saint and the Marquis must be somewhere nearby. She would give everything in the world not to cross paths with them. She understood perfectly well that she would still have to cross paths with the Saint before the task. A moment later, she froze in shock when she saw and heard the Saint. The Saint looked intently at the young lady and said that she heard everything. The Saint looked intently at Syria and asked if she had really come to save her. Lena asked the young lady if she was not ready to do this, even after everything she had done to her Syria. In turn looked at the Saint in confusion because she did not understand what she was saying. Sviata looked at her intently and said that Syria could not even imagine how scared she was. Syria said with a smile that she came as stern because she was called to help. She looked closely at the Saint and said that the high priest himself was here, so she had no choice. The Saint looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what kind of necklace she had. Syria was taken aback and looked at the Saint in surprise. She was shocked and did not understand why the Saint was suddenly interested in the necklace, because in the book everything was different. With the speed of lightning, the Saint's face changed and with a cold expression asked the young lady where she got the necklace. Syria, puzzled, said that the necklace was given to her by the Duke. The young lady in turn knew that it must have belonged to the Saint. The Saint asked angrily if this was a wedding gift. She asked the young lady if she and the Duke had already exchanged them. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she wanted the same for herself. Syria was shocked, and with her words she did not understand why the Saint suddenly wanted something like that. She understood perfectly well that there was something wrong here. She looked closely at the young lady and said that since it was a wedding present, she would like one like it. The Saint looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if when they divorced, she would return him to the Duke. Syria was taken aback by her question because she didn't expect to hear anything like that. The knight looked at the Marquis in surprise as he did not expect to see him. The Marquis looked closely at the knight and asked if Lady Syria was in. The knight looked away and said that it was so. A moment later, the Marquis was taken aback, for he heard the Saint asking the young lady, when they were divorced, whether she would return the gift to the Duke. The Marquis was taken aback as he clearly understood whose voice it was. The young lady looked at the Saint in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Syria was shocked and did not understand what the Saint had just said. She looked closely at the Saint and wondered if she had always been like this. She knew perfectly well that it was very strange because she did not at all resemble the character from the book. The young lady looked at the holy thing with a grin and said that it looked like she wanted to get it in a necklace. The Saint smiled and said that it was simply very beautiful. The Saint looked at the young lady with a grin and said that if she got bored with it, she could give it to her for her birthday. A few seconds later, the Marquis entered their tent and told the Saint to stop such conversations. The lovely ladies turned around and looked at the Marquis in surprise. The Marquis looked at the Saint with fury and asked how she could speak so calmly about the divorce of the aristocrats of the empire. The Saint was taken aback and shouted that everything was wrong. She looked at the Marquis intently and said that when they divorced, then Syria would be able to dissolve her marriage with the Duke so that they could get married. She said that was the reason she said her words. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that so be it, but still her words sounded very disgusting. Lena looked intently at the Marquis with tears in her eyes. A moment later, she shouted that she understood everything and decided to leave them with the speed of lightning. The Marquise was shocked by such behavior of the young saint and shouted after her, but it was all in vain because she did not turn around and ran away with the speed of lightning. The young lady in turn was puzzled. She did not understand why they had a family quarrel in her presence. Callis sighed heavily and called the young lady. He looked at her closely and said that it turned out that she had lost a little weight. Syria, in turn, looked away from him and said that it was none of his business and that he should go after the young saint. The Marquis was very surprised by her words. He shouted and called her, but he did not have time to finish as they were notified that monsters were approaching. A moment later, the knight shouted that the monsters were already in their camp. The young people were stunned by the news. The knight commander shouted to his subordinates to stay within range of Stern's forces. The young lady looked around carefully as she realized that there were far more monsters than she imagined. She knew very well that she needed to concentrate as quickly as possible. She knew that her power was capable of reaching the steel of the constellation within 5 kilometers. She just realized that if the knight went beyond the radius, his armor would quickly suck the heat out of him until he died from hypothermia. She understood that when fighting monsters, she and the knights had to be extremely careful. In turn, she was glad that the knowledge remained in her memory, and she really hoped that the saint remained within reach. But a moment later, they shouted to her that there was a monster behind her. Syria was taken aback and turned around with lightning speed. She froze in shock on the spot as she did not understand where the monster came from. But a moment later, the Marquise called her and repelled the monster's attack. The young lady fell to the ground with a crash. She was surprised because she did not expect to see the Marquise. A moment later, the knights ran towards them as they saw that the Marquise was having difficulty holding back the monster. With lightning speed, the knights surrounded Syria as they knew they had to protect her and the Marquis. She was shocked because she did not understand why he risked his life to protect her. The Marquis looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. She was in shock and wondered why he was trying to protect her after everything that had happened between them. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and shouted to the Marquis that he had had a monster of a day. But at the same time, the Duke came to their aid and dealt with this monster with lightning speed. The Marquis froze in shock when he saw the Duke defeat the monster. The Duke looked at the Marquis with anger and called him. Rush was very angry because he saw that the Marquis was not able to take care of himself. Syria looked at the Duke with a joyful smile and called him. The Duke looked at everyone present with cold fury and said that everyone here must be crazy. The Duke shouted angrily that they could only talk about the value of Sterna and nothing more. The young lady looked at the Duke, who had saved them, with a joyful smile. She was surprised she did not understand how he knew that she was in danger. A few seconds later, the Duke tenderly embraced his wife and said that he felt it because he was overwhelmed by the feeling that he could lose her. The young lady froze in embarrassment because she did not expect to hear such a thing. After his words, she also hugged him back. Syria, she said that she was still here, and if he didn't strangle her in his arms, after she managed to remain unharmed. In turn, the Duke hugged his wife tighter and quietly said that if she died, he would go in and bury all the nobles who asked her for help. Rush looked at her intently and asked with a puzzled expression, what if he hadn't made it in time? Syria was very confused by his words, but at the same time surprised because she didn't expect to see this side of him and hear such words. She sighed heavily and said that he should stop because everyone was staring at them. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they all knew that they were married. At the same time, the Marquis looked intently at the young people. Callis was surprised and at the same time puzzled because he did not understand when they had managed to become so close. A moment later, he turned around as he heard Lena's voice. The saint, alarmed, rushed towards him and asked what was wrong with his hand. The priests shouted to the saint that she had no place here and that she should return to her position, but the saint was very alarmed. She wanted to know what had happened and why the Marquise was wounded. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed the saint had gone mad. He did not understand how she could leave her place in the line. The priests took the saint away, but she rushed to the Marquis and called him. After some time, the priest approached the Marquis and began to heal him. Syria turned to look at the young people. Some time later, the high priest was scolding the saint furious and shouting that she was none other than Sterna. He shouted that he knew perfectly well that she had not completed her training, but still asked if the priest had not been training her when he had every spare minute. The young lady sighed heavily and quietly muttered the name of the Marquise. The high priest was furious, asking her how many more times he had to repeat it, because he knew perfectly well, like everyone else, that the Sterns played a key role during the fight with the monsters, and she should not leave her knights under any circumstances. He shouted that she shouldn't do something like that no matter what kind of relationship they had. He shouted with fury that he had explained this to her once. He looked at the saint intently and asked angrily, what if the knights had frozen to death during her absence? The young lady sighed heavily and quietly asked for forgiveness because she had not thought of that. As he left, the high priest said that they had come up with a plan to deal with the remaining monsters tomorrow, and he asked the saint to control herself for at least one day. The saint was furious. She wondered if it had done anything wrong. She understood perfectly well that the young lady would have done the same in her place. She wondered why she had such a relationship. Lena was furious as the high priest and Saria kept attacking her. She knew that they would experience the same terrible feelings that she was experiencing now. Abby sighed heavily and, looking around, realized that she had moved too far away from her mistress. A moment later, the knight shouted to her as there was a monster behind her. She looked back and noticed that there was nothing there. But a moment later, she sensed the presence of the monster and with lightning speed dealt with it. She sighed heavily as she realized that this was very strange, and a moment later she rushed to the knight and asked him furiously what he was planning. The young man was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. She looked at him furiously and asked why even he was taking her further and further away from Sterna. She furiously asked the young man why he was pretending to help her. Abby shouted with cold fury that he had previously been glued to the saint. She asked if it was the saint who had prompted him to do something like this. At the same time, the saint walked around the camp with a joyful smile. She wondered if the knight had done what she asked him to do. Some time ago, a young saint approached the knight with a smile and asked if he could help her with something else. He was surprised, but at the same time glad that she turned to him. So he smiled and said that he would do everything that she asked him to do. The young lady in turn wanted everyone in the world to be as good as your knight, but a moment later she was taken aback and looked into the distance. She noticed the Duke, who was heading straight for the meeting. A moment later she accidentally collided with the Duke. She was taken aback and stood frozen in shock when she collided with him, not understanding what had just happened. The Duke looked at the young saint in surprise and said that she must explain to him why she did this. The saint turned around and looked at him puzzled. She said that she did not understand what he was talking about because she had not done anything. He looked at her with fury and asked if she had done nothing. The Duke looked at her coldly and asked how she would explain the cut on his hand. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not her, and that was the truth. The Duke looked at her with cold fury and anger but said nothing. She looked at him timidly and said that it was true and she hadn't done anything at all. A moment later, the Duke turned and walked in the other direction, looking at the saint with his cold fury, and saying that he hoped that in the future she would not bother him. Lena froze for a moment and stared after him. She sighed heavily as she began to tremble. She sighed heavily and said with a grin that she had made the right choice her whole life. Now she clearly understood that the Marquis was the best option. Sometime later, Lena was very excited and confused because she did not understand how everything had come to this. She was shocked and did not understand how her knight had managed to get caught. The high priest looked at the young saint intently and asked angrily if it was true that she had sent a knight to stop Lady Abigail. The saint hesitated. She didn't know what to answer. She was shocked and excited because she couldn't imagine that everything would turn out like this. She looked at everyone present, trembling with fear, and told the priest that he had simply misunderstood her. The high priest was furious and did not understand what kind of correctness there could be. Lena said with tears in her eyes that she wanted to show that anyone would leave their post for the one who is dear to them, even Saria. Saria, in turn, froze in shock. She was furious and could not understand how Lena could do such a thing. Saria wondered if the saint had decided to take her protector away from her for such a trifle, risking her life. Saria in turn understood perfectly well that the saint knew that a knight who went beyond the radius of the force could die. The priest was furious. He shouted that he could no longer turn a blind eye to such actions. He said, "I advised that he had already told her earlier that she could serve in the Supreme Church for a month, and then he would personally escort her to the capital." He said angrily that he would have to take back his words, and she would now be removed from the church. Lena was shocked because she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was in shock and screamed that she would not survive in such conditions. The priest shouted that her first priority was her own sense of comfort, so she treated the life of a knight with amazing ease and frivolity. The young lady was furious. She did not understand what she had done because she had heard that she had already been imprisoned. The priest was furious. He shouted at the saint that she should not dare insult Sterna's personal knight. As she left, the saint shouted that they did not understand anything because she only wanted to open their eyes to the truth. The high priest shouted after the saint, but she decided to run away with her lightning speed. The man sighed heavily as he was puzzled by the whole situation. A moment later, Saria asked the priest for permission to speak with the saint. The young lady was furious. She understood that it was all unfair because she was supposed to be a jewel, but everyone only scolded her. She was shocked and wondered what she had done wrong. She knew perfectly well that it would have been better for them all to blame the one who had taken her place. A moment later, she heard a quiet voice that felt the divine power quietly whispering that he needed more power. The saint froze in shock as she saw in front of her the necklace she had previously seen on Saria. A voice quietly whispered to her that she should reach out to him and take the necklace. A moment later, a monstrous and terrible force entered Lena. Saria froze in shock when she saw the saint soaking up the dark power like a sponge. Saria was surprised and at the same time confused because she didn't understand what she had just seen. A moment later, she saw the saint fall to the ground with a crash. Saria, in turn, looked closely at the saint and wondered if she had absorbed all the darkness. Saria looked in surprise at the saint who was running away from her in a hurry. A moment later, she called the saint, but she ran away in a hurry. Saria understood perfectly well that she needed to act faster. She knew that she had to call the high priest, and he would instantly deal with the situation. The Duke was furious when he heard about everything. He understood perfectly well that the saint continued to do stupid things. He was very angry because he understood that it was not enough for her that she almost killed the knight, but now she also ran away. He asked the priest with cold fury if she was mocking them. He did not understand what they wanted from him. The priest trembled with fear and asked the Duke for forgiveness, but still he knew that the matter was very important, and therefore they asked him to give them his knights, his help. The Duke asked furiously what the high priest was doing. The priest said that the situation was very urgent, so he went to look for the light one with Lady Saria. The Duke froze in rage on the spot when he heard this. He looked at the priest with fury and asked if the young lady had really gone in search of the saint herself. The high priest sighed heavily and asked the young lady if she was sure that the saint had run in that direction. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was sure of it. He sighed heavily and said that no matter how much he lectured her, it all ended the same. Saria, in turn, was puzzled and excited because she did not understand what she saw then. At the same time, the priest was hastily looking for the saint. He was shouting and calling her. Saria thought for a moment as she realized that it looked like she had absorbed a demonic shadow. She wondered if the saint was trying to purify them. She was confused as she knew that in their book that didn't happen. A moment later, they finally found the saint. The priest looked intently at the young saint and called her. Lena screamed that they shouldn't come near her because she had done nothing wrong. The priest screamed that they knew it, but he still asked her to return to the camp first. They could discuss everything. He looked at her intently and with a smile said that if she gave up her position, there would be problems. Saria looked at the priest with alarm, wondering if she should tell him what she had seen. But a moment later, she screamed and told the priest to take care of himself because they were being attacked by a beast. Sometime later, the Duke with his knights and priests were looking for the saint, and everyone else. The Duke was puzzled because he did not know where his wife had gone. A moment later, the Marquis approached the Duke and called him. The Marquis looked closely at the Duke and asked if he had found any traces of Saria. The Duke looked at the young man with cold fury and said that at such a moment he should not worry about her. The Duke looked at the young man closely and asked if common sense had deserted him and the saint, since they had dragged the Duchess into a dangerous place. The Duke angrily told the Marquis that he was continuing to create trouble. He did not understand how long it would continue. The Duke in anger looked at the young man and said that as soon as they returned to the castle, they would have nothing to do with them. The Marquis froze in shock on the spot, but did not answer. A moment later, a knight ran up to them and called the Duke. He shouted that a new monster had appeared on the horizon. At the same time, the monster watched the young people with a predatory expression. The priest quickly ran up to the saint and said that she should jump towards him, but before she could reach him, a predatory monster suddenly attacked the high priest and knocked him to the ground. The high priest reached out to the young saint and shouted that she must run away and save herself. But after a few seconds, the beast furiously tore the high priest apart. Syria looked at the young saint with alarm and shouted that she must run away immediately. Syria saw that the saint froze in place. At the same time, the monster looked at the saint with a predatory look, preparing to strike her. But a few seconds later, the Duke arrived and dealt with the monster with lightning speed. The Duke looked at the saint with fury and said that he had recently made it clear that she should not cause trouble. The saint was taken aback and fell to the ground with a crash. Trembling with fear, she thanked the Duke for saving her. She thanked him several times, but suddenly the Duke froze as he felt something unusual. He turned around and looked in surprise at the young lady who was calling him in a hurry. But after a few seconds, they all saw that the saint was engulfed in light. Lena screamed and prayed for salvation. She reached out to the Duke and frantically begged him for help. She was in shock and screamed that it was too early for her. In turn, the Duke reached out to Youth with water, but it was all in vain because it gradually disappeared. He froze in shock as she disappeared before his eyes. Syria was stunned because she understood that this situation happened for the second time. Syria knew very well that in history the saint came and returned to her world several times through the moon. The first time she disappeared for a short time, so this incident is described in one line. But the next time she disappeared for a long period which lasted a whole year. It was then that she made the Duke and Marquis realize their love for her, something they had not noticed before. The foreshadowing that happened is the beginning of the main story. The young lady in turn tried in every way to avoid this. Syria was well aware that the place and circumstances of her disappearance were completely different. But in turn, she knew that only one thing remained constant. Just like in the book, they both reached out to each other. The Duke turned around and looked intently at the young lady. He came closer to her and called her. She was shocked and didn't know what to do. She wondered if she would just have to watch history unfold. She looked intently at the Duke, expecting him to speak first. She wondered if she could avoid a future where they both fell in love with her. She was worried and did not know whether she would die or live. The priest looked at the young lady closely and thanked her for coming. She was very excited and worried and also upset because she saw that the priests were grieving for their high priest. The priest sighed heavily. He was glad that she would pray for the high priest. A moment later, the young lady started as she heard the voice of her husband. The Duke looked at her intently, asked what she was doing there. She said that she had come to place a lock of her hair on the lid of the high priest's coffin because they said that this was good for the deceased. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he wished he could do it for her because she didn't need to see him in such a state. The young lady slowly returned to her place. She looked closely at all the knights because she saw that they looked pitiful. She knew that this was not surprising because the saint was missing and the high priest was dead. She remembered his soft smile and his words that touched her deepest. In turn, she wondered if he died in the novel itself. The young lady sighed heavily because she did not remember anything like that. She only knew that the saint had not disappeared here, for she had followed the Duke to a frozen lake in the Burke estate and had suddenly disappeared. Then the young Duke felt guilty for what had happened because he could not save her. Although she was standing very close, the feeling of guilt before her gradually changed, and after some time such a feeling turned into love. She looked closely at the Duke and asked if he felt guilty about what had happened. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked whom he should feel guilty towards. He asked if he really felt guilty towards her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the question was inappropriate and they should forget about it. He looked at her in surprise and asked how he could answer if he did not fully understand the question. He looked at her intently and said that she should finish speaking. Syria looked at the Duke intently and asked if he felt guilty before the saint. The Duke froze in place in surprise because he did not expect such a question. Syria looked at the Duke closely and said that she was sure that he understood perfectly well what was being discussed. She did not understand why he continued to ask clarifying questions. The Duke said that he did not expect to hear such questions at all, so he thought that she was talking about someone else. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't understand her at all and didn't understand why he should feel guilty. He looked at her intently and asked if she was really worried that he would torment himself with guilt for not being able to save her when he was there. She sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. The Duke slowly approached her and said that it was now clear to him why she was frowning so much. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled and said that the inner corners of her eyebrows were turned up. She looked away from him in embarrassment and said that she had nothing like that. He smiled and said that from her expression, her face, you can always tell what she feels, but it would still be better for him to know specifically what she feels. He said that the saint herself decided to escape from the camp. He did not force her to leave, so he did not feel guilty. Saria looked closely at the Duke because she did not understand why he behaved in such a way. She understood perfectly well that it was in a situation like this that he realized his feelings for her. She was now completely confused because she tried very hard to change the plot, but every time everything ended as it was written in it, and the worst thing was that her attempts led to the death of an innocent person. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard someone calling her, and with the speed of lightning, she threw all her thoughts away and returned to reality. The young girl looked at the lady intently and presented her with an offering in honor of the deceased. Saria, in turn, looked at the girl with a soft smile and thanked her. She sighed heavily as, unfortunately, she was unable to explain herself to the Duke. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with concern that it seemed the death of the high priest had shocked her greatly. He said that she should prepare herself because they would soon be heading back to the castle. The young lady sighed heavily. She hoped that he was not offended by her. She understood perfectly well that she needed to apologize to him. A moment later, she looked at the glass in surprise as she realized it contained wine. The Marquis looked at her intently and said that she should not drink it. She was surprised and looked at him as she did not expect to see him. A moment later, he took the glass from her and gave her his flask. She screamed that she could do without his help and also asked to return her heavy bag back. He apologized and said that he could not do this and also poured the contents on the ground. He looked at her intently and said that she was allergic to strawberries. As he was leaving, he said that she could keep the flask. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand where he was going. She shouted after him that she did not need his flask. A moment later, she shouted that she would throw it out. The knight looked closely at Saria and called her. A moment later, he said that he had finished preparing the carriage and had come to pick her up. The young lady froze in place. He came closer to her and, looking at her in surprise, asked where she got the flask from. She sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that some tramp had dropped it. He looked at her in surprise as he noticed that she belonged to the Marquis. Saria was taken aback because she did not understand how he knew about such a thing. He looked at her closely and said that the flask had the family crest of his house on it. She looked closely at the flask and was convinced of his words. The young lady in turn was puzzled because she understood that if someone else had noticed her, there would have been a scandal. The knights looked at her intently and asked what was inside the flask. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the wine inside was because the priests had prepared theirs from strawberries to which she was allergic. The knight looked at her in surprise as he did not expect this. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that the Duke would be upset when they found out about this. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was saying such a thing. He sighed heavily and said it didn't matter, but now he was beginning to understand why the Duke always asked him to accompany her everywhere.